CD4.
It was a dangerous state to be in, actually. My self-respect gave way to a terrible self-loathing. I despised myself for having let myself get into this situation, yet I found it difficult to explain it to anyone else. On the surface, it was all perfectly calm. I never shouted at him, never objected really. I suppose I knew he wouldn't hear my objections, the same way he never heard anything else I said. Friends used to ask me, "What's wrong? Where's your spunk gone?" And I thought it would seem disloyal or pathetic to tell them the truth. Sometimes it felt as if I was being punished, and at my lowest ebb, I wondered if I'd done something to deserve it. Finally, Athena suggested I see a therapist, and I gradually worked up the courage to tell Berry how I was feeling. His response was totally predictable. He acted puzzled and claimed he always listened to what I had to say and always tried to behave in ways that would please me. He seemed genuinely deaf to what I was actually saying. When I finally said I was leaving, he didn't really seem to believe me. The day I moved out, he just stood there, half smiling, as if he thought I would inevitably come crawling back. I'll never forget that look. I think it's the only time I ever actually hated him. 2 years later, I met and married Ross, and I can tell you two things about being married to an attentive listener. One is that you know you are valued. The other is that you feel more confident about who you are. In fact, if you asked me what's the best thing about being with Ross, I'd say that I feel better about myself than I ever have before. Oh, we have plenty of disagreements, some of them pretty robust, but at least we always know what we're arguing about.
When we find ways of assuring other people that they are being fully attended to, the results can be dramatic. Like the programs in many schools and local communities that put young people in touch with older people in retirement villages and nursing homes. Imagine the impact on people who might be feeling socially marginalised and lonely when a couple of enthusiastic kids roll up to talk, and more particularly to listen to them, to hear their stories, perhaps to record those stories for an oral history project, to take selfies with them. The social entrepreneur Samantha Heron runs a program like that in Sydney called STEP, Seniors and Teens Empathy Program. It unleashes powerful emotions in both generations. When the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 prevented the teens from making their regular visits to a particular nursing home, they took to writing letters instead. The excitement of the seniors at receiving handwritten letters from their newfound young friends was almost matched by the fun the teens had in writing them. As one eager teenager proudly told Samantha, "That's the first letter I've ever written." Why is being heard so therapeutic? It's not simply that when someone listens to me, I receive that as the gift of their undivided attention, wonderful though that is. It's also that when I'm encouraged to say what's on my mind, that can be a clarifying experience, as if hearing myself speak my thoughts helps me to make sense of those thoughts, to unravel what might have been a jumble of ideas, feelings, concerns, and half-formed notions, but which now emerge in a sequence of words, however rough and ready that might be. In Kitchen Table Wisdom, the American medical practitioner and co-founder of the Commonweal Cancer Help Program, Rachel Naomi Remen, puts it more poetically than that. Listening creates a holy silence. When you listen generously to people, they can hear truth in themselves often for the first time. She describes listening as the oldest and perhaps the most powerful tool of healing. Putting thoughts, especially troubled thoughts, into words can indeed be a kind of therapy, the talking cure, but most of us are reluctant to talk to ourselves and not willing or able to write something that might help clarify what we think. Many authors admit that that's precisely why they write, to find out what they think. So we need listeners. Remen again. Our listening creates sanctuary for the homeless parts within the other person. Potent signs that we are heard. Apologies and forgiveness. Two people in my past were notorious for their inability to apologise. In the first case, a clergyman, it appeared to be a matter of principle, since he was heavily into the concept of Christian perfectionism and presumably thought to apologise would be to concede that he was prone to error like the rest of us. The young people in his congregation, far from seeing his intransigence as a sign of perfection, simply thought him arrogant. The second case seemed to be a matter of genuine moral blindness, an inability to see that offence had been given, or that an expression of remorse might not only be the most appropriate response, but also the necessary step towards healing. There is a weird strand running through our culture that sees an apology as a great concession, as though we admit too much by apologising. Never explain, never apologise is a line often, though wrongly, attributed to Henry Ford. What he actually said, after being convicted on a drink driving charge, was never complain, never explain, which was itself a quote from British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. But never explain, never apologise has lodged in our folklore as being somehow tough, strong and admirable, sometimes followed by the ridiculous extension, it's a sign of weakness. How could it be weak to acknowledge that my behaviour has hurt or offended someone, however unintentional the offence might have been? How could it be weak to offer someone the therapeutic gift of an apology? On the contrary, a sincere apology suggests that I am sufficiently secure in my sense of self to admit my error and to be willing to repair whatever damage, emotional or otherwise, I might have inflicted. Put yourself in the place of a person you have wronged or offended by your actions or words. What does that person most want from you? An apology, obviously, because an apology sends a clear signal that you are taking them seriously. An apology demonstrates that you have heard the hurt. Conversely, the withholding of an apology says, without needing to put it into words, that I don't take you seriously enough to bother apologising to you, and that compounds the hurt. Yet many of us struggle with the challenge of making an apology, since apologising requires a double measure of virtue, one part humility, the queen of virtues, French philosopher Simone Weil called it, one part courage, enough humility to admit we've erred, enough courage to face the consequences. People who worship the idols of power and status might hesitate to apologise because they realise that a genuine apology not only implies an admission of error, but also puts us on an equal footing with the person we have wronged. You can't apologise sincerely while mounted on your high horse. If I've offended you, our relative positions in some real or imaginary pecking order simply become irrelevant. A boss apologising to an employee demands precisely the same blend of humility and courage as an employee apologising to a boss. The same goes for official apologies from governments, churches, banks, or other corporations to victims of institutional negligence, criminality, or arrogance. Humility is an essential part of the deal. Those apologies must also be offered in a spirit of equality. Otherwise, they can simply look like yet another thing being done to the victim. The Australian Parliament's formal apology to the stolen generations, delivered by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008, being mainly confined to just one aspect of the mistreatment of our First Peoples, has had less enduring power than it might have had if it had been broader in its scope and the result of a sustained, negotiated settlement, possibly expressed in a formal treaty. Nevertheless, it was an emotional experience for many Indigenous Australians who felt that for all its limitations and lack of follow-through, it was a welcome symbol of recognition of at least some of the injustices of the past. The subsequent dismissive response of successive federal governments to the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart demonstrates how far we still need to travel before Sorry Day acquires the deep symbolic significance it could have. In every case where a serious apology is called for, whether personally or institutionally, we need to admit our error, demonstrate that we understand the hurt we have inflicted on the other person, express our remorse, apologise, and where appropriate, offer some reparation. Anything less is hollow, like the mealy-mouthed "I'm sorry you feel like that," which is an especially callous way of avoiding a sincere apology by implying that the victim is somehow inadequate. By the way, there's no use-by date on apologies. I once received a generous apology from someone who felt he had treated me unfairly in a panel discussion at a writers' festival more than a year previously. Despite the late arrival of that apology, it meant a great deal to me. I had felt overlooked and undervalued at the time. Now I didn't. To err is human, to forgive divine. I'm sure you're familiar with that quote from Alexander Pope. It's so rich in connotations that it has practically become part of our folklore. Why does it resonate so powerfully with us? Is it because it appears to offer us a cop-out from the need to forgive? Oh, well, we're all human, we all err, so what? We can leave forgiveness for our failings to the Almighty. Was that Pope's message? Unfortunately not. Pope's point was that our capacity to forgive each other is such a noble aspect of human behaviour that it is indeed divine in its effect. One of the greatest acts of forgiveness in the 20th century, Nelson Mandela, forgiving those who had held him captive for 27 years, both astonished and inspired us. We recognised it immediately as a noble demonstration of humanity at its best. That act of forgiveness alone helps to explain why Mandela became one of the most widely loved figures of his time. In one hit, forgiveness offers potent therapeutic benefits to both the forgiver and the forgiven. Research into the psychology of forgiveness shows that forgiving someone for hurting or offending you is an effective way of reducing your own stress level and lowering your blood pressure, though seeking those collateral benefits would hardly count as an admirable motivation for forgiving someone. By contrast, failing to forgive, nursing a grudge, harbouring a bitter resentment has adverse health consequences. And that's just the effects on the one doing the forgiving. Consider the benefits to the one who is forgiven. When we know we've wronged or offended someone, guilt is our natural reaction, since guilt is the sign that our moral machinery is in working order. But no one enjoys living with guilt, which is why we are prepared to swallow our pride and apologise in the hope of receiving forgiveness from the person we have wronged. When we are forgiven, that burden of guilt is lifted and our emotional equilibrium begins to be restored. But when forgiveness is withheld, guilt can fester, sometimes for years. In that way, the withholding of forgiveness is a way of inflicting additional suffering on an already guilty person. It's unhealthy for them, it's unhealthy for us. Since everything we know about the psychological mechanism of forgiveness says that withholding it is bad for us, why would we hesitate? For some of us, the answer is that we are unable to let go of the sense of having been wronged, as if we are determined to incorporate our resentment or outrage or victimhood into our sense of self. Look how badly I've been treated. Such statements can become mantras repeated for years by those who cling too tightly to their grievance. More generally, the answer is that forgiveness, like other acts of human kindness, such as attentive listening or the making of a sincere apology, does not come easily. In fact, it often seems more natural to plot our revenge or to let the guilty one squirm. It's especially hard to forgive someone who appears totally unburdened by guilt, has never apologised, and is simply getting on with their life, possibly cocooned by arrogance or insensitivity, or blithely unaware of how badly they have hurt us. Some acts are so vile, so brutal, or so insensitive that it's easy to imagine how forgiveness could seem impossible to the people on the receiving end. A person who had been sexually abused as a child would struggle to forgive the parent or friend or teacher or sports coach or priest responsible, yet some do. A rape victim would find it almost imaginably hard to forgive the perpetrator, yet some do. A family would understandably balk at the prospect of forgiving someone who had murdered their son or daughter. Again, some do. Such heroic acts of forgiveness, though rare, have much to teach us, in particular this lesson. Until we forgive, we are condemned to remain victims. Where in their hearts would Indigenous Australians find the wherewithal to forgive the European settlers who treated their land as if it belonged to no one and slaughtered thousands of their forebears, whose descendants stole their children, who are still incarcerating Indigenous people at 10 times the rate of non-Indigenous people? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people comprise 2% of the total Australian population and 28% of the prison population. How forgiving could they feel towards generations of political leaders who have rejected the idea of a treaty, or towards Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who wouldn't contemplate even a discussion of the idea of an Indigenous voice to the National Parliament on Indigenous issues, as envisaged by the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. Although Prime Minister Scott Morrison initially followed Turnbull's lead, his coalition government was, at the time of writing, exploring possible legislation to accommodate aspects of the Voice to Parliament proposal as a potential forerunner to constitutional change. Under the Prime Ministership of Paul Keating, many of these issues had been acknowledged, particularly in Keating's famous Redfern speech of 1992, the same year in which the High Court found in favour of Eddie Mabo's claim for native land title. Yet the problems associated with Indigenous people persist to an extent that makes true reconciliation, involving both apology and forgiveness, still seem a long way off. Forgiveness given in response to an apology says as powerfully as any act of compassion can that I hear you. It restores the harmony we had lost. Apology and forgiveness are woven together in beautiful symmetry. Like any other expression of our most positive and admirable human qualities, forgiveness calls on deep reserves of moral courage, the courage to break out of the spiral of self-pity, the courage to set aside resentment, the courage to rise above bitterness, the courage to act well when all our instincts call on us to act badly. I don't forgive you out of some lofty position of unimpeachable moral superiority. I forgive you because I see my own frailty reflected in you. I hear my own voice in yours. I forgive you because I understand what it means to be human. Here's how English poet Elizabeth Jennings described forgiveness in her poem of that name. It is the word which we surrender by. It is the language where we have to live, for all torn tempers, sulks and brawls at last lie down in huge relief, as if the world paused on its axis. And what about the tritely uttered forgive and forget? Is that possible? Answer, neither possible nor desirable. Forgiving someone is a kind and generous thing to do, but it doesn't obliterate our memory of the action that called for forgiveness. It doesn't wipe the slate clean. That would make a mockery of the forgiveness. When we forgive, we are not saying, let's go on as if nothing has happened. Rather, we're saying something far more significant. Let's go on knowing this has happened and also knowing I have truly forgiven you. Listening attentively, apologizing sincerely, forgiving generously. This is the holy trinity of proofs that I acknowledge and respect you as an authentic presence in my life. The pain of loneliness. Who will hear me? As we reminded ourselves in Chapter 2, humans, like most of the animal species on this planet, are herd animals. We belong in groups, families, communities. Although most of us also need regular periods of isolation to preserve our sanity and marshal our resources for the demanding business of belonging to a social species, we are mostly incapable of thriving for long on our own. Like all herd animals, we suffer when we are cut off from the herd. That's why in our criminal justice system, solitary confinement is the worst punishment we can think of. We noted in Chapter 1 how prolonged social isolation is associated not only with a heightened risk of loneliness, anxiety, and depression, but also with an assortment of other ailments ranging from hypertension to cognitive decline. Many health professionals now regard social isolation as a greater threat to public health than obesity. Knowing that, ponder this. In 2018, the Australian Psychological Society and Swinburne University of Technology published the results of a national survey showing that 25% of all Australians report feeling lonely for most of every week, with the highest levels of loneliness reported in the 18 to 25 age group, who are paradoxically our most connected generation when it comes to the use of social media. Connected but lonely has become a popular label for heavy users of IT. It turns out that the emotional richness of face-to-face encounters, incorporating eye contact and possibly touch, plus all the nuances of tone of voice, facial expressions, posture, and gestures, simply can't be reproduced online. Who'd have thought? Swinburne's Dr. Michelle Lim, the scientific chair of the End Loneliness Together project and Australia's leading expert on loneliness, describes loneliness as an innate human signal to connect, similar to a signal to eat when one is hungry. She points out that the desire to connect is normal because humans have evolved and thrived within social groups since the beginning of time. Lim defines loneliness as the subjective and aversive feeling of social isolation, often expressed in statements such as, "I do not feel in tune with others." People don't have to be alone in order to feel lonely, and people who spend a lot of time alone don't necessarily feel lonely, though social isolation obviously increases the risk. Think of loneliness as an always unpleasant and sometimes distressing emotional response to a feeling of isolation, a negative reaction to a lack of social connection, even in the presence of other people. If you accept the definition of a disease as being something that either from outside or inside the body negatively affects our well-being, then loneliness certainly qualifies as a disease. In fact, given those APS Swinburne figures, it's fair to say that we were experiencing an epidemic of loneliness long before COVID-19 visited us. During the period of global self-isolation in response to that virus, loneliness itself briefly became a pandemic. Connected but angry might well be a parallel phenomenon. The quasi-connections provided by social media, when they occur at the expense of personal encounters, contribute not only to loneliness but also to the anger, sometimes masked as surliness or irritability, that many people feel when their face-to-face social needs are not being met. It's no mere coincidence that for all their many benefits, social media have become a vehicle for the unrestrained expression of anger, even though the origins of that anger in the pain of loneliness might not be apparent to those experiencing it. Social media have turned out to be a remarkably safe hiding place from which to hurl abuse, obscenities, and angry epithets. Feelings that might be expressed in a more restrained and civilized manner, if at all, in face-to-face encounters, can take on a far darker tone when they are let loose from the coward's castle of cyberspace. The underlying message is often as simple as, "Now you'll take me seriously," even though, paradoxically, the me remains hidden from view. Conspiracy theories often arise from a sense of powerlessness that finds its expression in anger directed towards particular individuals or groups, whether political, religious, ethnic, cultural, or otherwise, or the Western way of life, or whoever or whatever can be blamed for the conspiracy theorists' feelings of despair. the global phenomenon of QAnon, the ultimate example of groundless conspiracy theories and vaguely religious-sounding prophecies, thrives at least partly because of that anon in its name. Thanks to the internet, anonymity has become the passport to the free expression of hate, anger, disillusionment, or fear, a problem that won't be solved until the identity of the sender becomes an automatic, inescapable part of every social media post. But it is our increasing social fragmentation that creates the weirdly permissive atmosphere in which such phenomena can flourish. The most realistic way to interpret the fact that we and comparable Western societies are experiencing social fragmentation on such a large scale is to see it as a self-inflicted wound. We have created a culture of such radical individualism, where self-actualization is regarded as our greatest accomplishment, that social fragmentation, with its heightened risk of social isolation, is the inevitable consequence. A steady rise in the number of single-person households, already accounting for 25% of all Australian households, our high dependency on IT at the expense of face-to-face encounters, our excessive busyness, that classic barrier to social cohesion, our increasing mobility, our high rate of relationship breakdown. Should we be surprised to discover that we are a society struggling with loneliness? The pendulum will eventually swing back towards a more realistic and healthier sense of our true nature as communitarians. But in the meantime, it's easy to see not only why loneliness has reached epidemic proportions, but also why it's so unhealthy for us. The very essence of loneliness is that we lack the sense of being heard, appreciated, attended to, and acknowledged. If I feel lonely, who can I trust with my innermost thoughts, fears, hopes, dreams, doubts, and anxieties? Who will listen? Not everyone who lives alone feels lonely, of course. There's a big difference between people whose circumstances have thrust solo householder status on them involuntarily through bereavement, relationship breakdown, relocation for work, or other factors beyond their control, and those who have deliberately chosen to live alone. Many voluntary soloists anticipate with pleasure the moment when they can shut the door on the world, punch the air and shout, "Alone at last." Many relish their solo householder status as a symbol of freedom and independence. Many say they know where to find people when they want them and are very happy to enjoy their privacy and solitude the rest of the time. But it's often more complex than that. In my studies of people's experience of living alone, I've encountered many individuals who, while claiming to love their privacy and independence, also admitted to occasional feelings of emotional vulnerability. Sometimes these surfaced in the form of specific questions. Are humans meant to live alone? Is it healthy for us? Sometimes they emerged in little anecdotes about obsessive checks of locked doors or leaving a light on all night. Some solo householders like to turn the TV on before they go out, so they won't return to an empty-feeling house. In one poignant interview, a young woman living alone shyly reported that on Christmas morning she had crept out of bed and gone to her Christmas tree in the living room to see if anyone had left her a present. Being a solo householder might not entail feelings of loneliness, but it clearly heightens the risk. Even in a multiple-person household, Being too busy to engage fully with the life of the household can induce loneliness, as can being so addicted to IT devices that the other members of a household come to seem less interesting or less important than whatever is being attended to on that little screen. There are many pathways to social isolation, and they are all risky. To feel isolated, to feel lonely, to feel that there's no one there, is to face the bleak recognition that when I want to say something, no one will hear me. Remember that quote from Rachel Naomi Remen? Our listening creates sanctuary for the homeless parts within the other person. If there is no one to listen, those parts remain homeless. Here's how Carl Rogers described the power of listening to release someone from loneliness. Almost always, when a person realizes he has been deeply heard, his eyes moisten. I think in some real sense he is weeping for joy. It is as though he were saying, "Thank God somebody heard me. Someone knows what it's like to be me." Relevance deprivation syndrome. Being heard is not only about being listened to. It can also refer to a lack of more general recognition or appreciation for who you are or what you've done. Gareth Evans, a former Australian foreign minister, coined the expression relevance deprivation syndrome to describe how it feels to be removed from the position of being a minister in a government to being a mere member of the opposition frontbench. Power, status and influence have been diminished to be replaced by a certain sense of futility. Evans himself had a distinguished career inside and outside Parliament, including a long stint as an effective and influential Chancellor of the Australian National University, but his coinage has caught on. The term relevance deprivation syndrome has come to be associated with far more than a loss of political power or prestige. It is now a useful label for the many people who, having never felt the thrill, if that's what it is, of political power, have nevertheless had to cope with the sense of loss, often associated with retirement, retrenchment, unemployment, or relegation to a lower position than they once held. It's sometimes unkindly referred to as passing your use-by date. Evans might have created that cute label for it, but the condition has been around forever and can be applied to societies as well as individuals. Britain shows signs of not yet having come to terms with the loss of empire. Britons still love to sing "Rule Britannia" as if they mean it. And what of Vienna? After World War I, it was reduced from being the capital of an empire to merely the capital of Austria. But relevance deprivation syndrome is a term we most often apply to individuals to describe a rather desolate feeling of being overlooked. At the other end of the political and social spectrum from Gareth Evans, here's the French Count Robert de Montesquieu, quoted by Julian Barnes in The Man in the Red Coat, bemoaning his lost status at the end of the Belle Epoque. You are still there, in a state of greater or lesser dilapidation, and still holding on, with your faculties intact, but now ill-suited to the taste of the day. You have fallen into disuse, and have become a stranger to the very contemporary civilization you once led, yet whose current manifestations do not wound or shock you as much as they appear empty and futile. An impenetrable barrier now separates you. People who were once prominent in their profession might have to contend not simply with younger people replacing them and doing things differently, which is both inevitable and generally desirable, but with a lack of acknowledgement of the foundations they laid, or the encouragement and training they gave those younger people on their way up, or the innovations they introduced, which were as radical in their day as today's innovations are now. The sense of being shoved aside is tough to bear. Having to accept that people are no longer interested in where you've come from or what you've done can be a bitter pill to swallow. The role of the ego in all this is easy to spot, but it's not just a matter of ego. It goes to our deep need to be heard and acknowledged for who we are and what we've done. If someone has given 40 years of his life to driving a bus, isn't that worth recognition? Doesn't he deserve to feel not only that we acknowledge and appreciate his service, but also that we remember that about him? If someone has spent her adult life as a primary school teacher, helping hundreds of children to flourish as young learners, wouldn't she be entitled to feel slightly chagrined, as if this were never remembered or acknowledged after she had retired? By acknowledged, I don't mean that she or he should be given a medal for services rendered, nor do I mean that people who have had paid work outside the home should receive any more recognition than those parents who chose to stay at home and raise their children, though they too might experience some relevance deprivation syndrome when the children eventually leave home. I simply mean that the rest of us need to keep in mind that everyone we encounter has a backstory, that we can't hope to understand anyone fully until we've heard their story, and that they won't feel fully appreciated if their story is never heard. What happens when we are not heard? Some people feel no more than irritation when they are not heard. A spouse who has long realised that her partner doesn't listen properly and has learned to live with that might seek consolation via the more receptive ears of attentive friends. Or a person who is well known as a non-listener might be tolerated or indulged as a member of a friendship circle because of a long association, residual affection, or sympathy. Those are mild reactions. Feeling a bit sad, a bit disappointed, a bit neglected, are almost equally benign responses to knowing that we are not heard. I once asked an elderly woman about her background. "I have no background," she said, without rancour, as if she was so accustomed to being unacknowledged that my question took her by surprise. I recall another person who said in response to something I had asked him, "I'm not an interesting person." He was wrong, of course, as I was soon to discover. Everyone's story is interesting, but he was not accustomed to being listened to, so he had adapted to the idea that his own story did not warrant anyone's attention. At the other extreme, some people choose suicide rather than having to go on feeling ignored, isolated, marginalised, misunderstood, or unloved. They might have perceived, rightly or wrongly, that no one was listening to them or taking their anxieties or grievances seriously, and interpreted that as rejection. How many distraught parents, siblings, or friends have said, "If only we'd listened"? Every year in Australia, more than 3,000 people take their own life, and about 60,000 people make a suicide attempt. There are many factors involved. Each case is unique. But when an attempt is interpreted as a cry for help, That usually means we can recognise it as a person's plea to be taken more seriously, to be appreciated for the person they are, not the person others want or expect them to be. Some people, frustrated by the sense of being ignored, go in search of groups of similarly disaffected people to plot their revenge, possibly through vandalism or violence, on a society they perceive as uncaring. They might also be peculiarly vulnerable to overtures from radical groups that seem to offer a sympathetic welcome and a listening ear. Members of an oppressed or marginalised minority might eventually turn their sense of humiliation and despair into outrage, expressed through protest movements such as Black Lives Matter. The underlying message of such movements always is that everyone deserves to be heard. All lives matter, since that is the first step towards justice, restitution, and reconciliation. Some individuals feeling underappreciated or misunderstood lash out at those they wish would love them more. Others simply withdraw into a dangerous, smouldering isolation. However mild or severe the response, the grievance is the same. I was not heard. I was not appreciated. I was not included. I was not understood. People of limited cognitive capacity also need to be heard. We often talk about the disadvantaged as people needing our special attention, and of course that's right, they do. The poor, the homeless, the frail, the unemployed, the lonely, people with disabilities, people suffering from anxiety and other forms of mental illness, refugees, and people seeking asylum. Many members of our society have special needs. We don't talk so easily or comfortably about the struggle faced by people of limited cognitive capacity. I'm not talking about trendy stuff like emotional intelligence, though I fully acknowledge that a lack of EQ is a real issue for the people who suffer from it, often without realising they have a problem, which is, of course, part of the problem. It's also a source of irritation and perplexity to those who have to live and work with them. No, I'm talking about the qualities psychologists have historically referred to as general intelligence, which I'd prefer to call cognitive capacity. About 30% of the population live with a cognitive capacity that is well below average, sometimes exacerbated by inadequate education or poor lifestyle. As the population ages, elderly people will inevitably swell the ranks of the cognitively challenged, since genetic inheritance doesn't only determine our intelligence, but may also determine our likelihood of developing dementia later in life. In some ways, the experience of having your cognitive capacity impaired by the effects of a stroke, brain atrophy, or other forms of degeneration is tougher than for those who have only ever known a more limited cognitive experience. Rather like relevance deprivation syndrome, cognitive impairment due to illness or injury can seem like an especially cruel blow because of the contrast between how things were and how they now are. And if people with dementia or other forms of cognitive impairment or decline are treated by the rest of us as if they are no longer worthy of the level of attention we previously gave them, the cruelty is compounded. Most people reading this book, or any book, will have above average intelligence. So it's quite difficult for you to imagine what it must feel like to function with a lower level of intelligence than yours. Not serious impairment, just the challenge of living with a cognitive capacity that means you might never master the skill of literacy. You might struggle to understand a bus timetable or follow the directions on your medication. You might be baffled by the complexity of bureaucratic pathways that are supposed to help you. And you might make repeatedly poor choices about sexual partners, drugs, money, or diet. By the way, plenty of highly intelligent people make poor choices too. Just one of the many reasons why no one should feel smug about a high IQ. These might be people who can work, shop, rent a home, make friends, fall in love and raise a family, but still do things that others might judge to be stupid. In fact, what are you, stupid? Is an especially heartless thing to say to a person who might normally function pretty well, but will occasionally expose the effects of limited cognitive capacity and/or inadequate schooling. There is little any of us can do about our genetic inheritance, whether in our height or intelligence or any other genetically determined quality, except work within the limits it imposes on us. There is simply no point in literate people railing against others' illiteracy, as if it's somehow the fault of the illiterate, or their teachers, or the system. About 20% of the population are unable to read and write fluently. One sign of how civilized we are is how sensitive we are to their situation, and how clever we are at creating ways of helping them navigate their way around society. More visual and less verbal signage, for instance, or more oral and fewer written instructions. Not the sharpest tool in the toolbox, one sandwich short of a picnic, the shallow end of the gene pool. All such jibes are intended as amusing ways of pointing to mild cognitive limitations. Amusing, that is, if you're not on the receiving end. Amusing if your heart is not breaking for a loved one who struggles to keep up. Amusing if you have no understanding of the challenges some people have to contend with. The victims of such remarks are often smart enough to know their limitations, to be frustrated by them, and to realise that others are mocking them, however gently, for their perceived inadequacies. The way we treat people who happen to be less intelligent than we are is a sign of how well we understand our responsibilities as members of this species. If we truly get the idea of our common humanity, we will work at developing greater compassion, greater empathy, and an acceptance of everyone's need to be heard, regardless of their mental capacity, height, weight, ethnicity, verbal fluency, personal tastes or preferences, or the wisdom of the choices they make. If you want a friend in Washington, buy a dog. That remark was made by US President Harry Truman, though many people outside Washington and outside politics clearly feel the same way. In my career as a social researcher, I was often struck by how animated, engaged, and moist-eyed my research respondents became when they were talking about their pets. Many said they preferred pets to people. Many spoke of the joy of returning home to a pet that was always reliably pleased to see them. Many spoke of a deep sense of connection with their pets, and of the feelings of comfort and security generated by the presence of pets, particularly dogs, in their home and often on their bed. Many assured me that their dogs, and sometimes their cats, but not their goldfish, were attentive listeners. Our enthusiasm for pet ownership is revealed in statistics. As the birth rate falls well below replacement level in most Western countries, the rate of pet ownership rises. In Australia, we are outnumbered by our pets, 25 million of us, 29 million of them. According to the RSPCA, about 60% of households own a pet, 40% have a dog, 27% a cat, plus assorted birds, fish, rabbits, guinea pigs and mice. We know many of those pets are child substitutes, if only because of the names they are given. These days you'll struggle to find a dog called Spot, Fido, Smudge or Bozo. Instead you'll meet any number of Sophies, Millies, Bruces or Winstons. I recently had a canine neighbour called Nigella. She had a human housemate, a young woman who, not surprisingly, was devoted to her dog's namesake, a TV celebrity cook. But there's more to this phenomenon than pets serving as child substitutes. Given what we know about the rise of loneliness as a social issue, pets are highly valued as companions for people living alone, for couples with no children, for children with no siblings, and with Western birth rates falling, there will be a growing number of those, and for those who simply can't imagine life without a pet to come home to pat, and to be adored by. There's research evidence to back people's belief that pets are good for you. Being around a pet, especially one you can stroke and cuddle, is demonstrably good for reducing stress levels and lowering levels of anxiety, depression, and blood pressure. What does all this tell us about ourselves? First, that being herd animals, we crave close companionship. Second, that our personal relationships are often disappointing. Third, that patient listening and unconditional love are sometimes easier to find in a pet than a partner, since pets are not distracted by ego-driven desires, busyness, or smartphones. Pets obviously satisfy our deep need to be heard, appreciated and understood, though how much of this is down to an owner's pleasing fantasy about what's going on inside their pet's mind is impossible to know. But there's a lesson to be learned from our passion for pets. We ourselves need to become more attentive listeners, more loyal friends, and more loving companions if we want to ensure that we don't come off too badly by comparison with pets. Knowing what we know about the universal need for recognition, to be heard, to be taken seriously, to be respected, what should we do differently? Here are 5 notes to self. Say less, listen more. As long as you're talking, you can't be listening. Take your turn to speak, but only when you're certain you have heard and understood what the other person is trying to say. It would be a serious error to assume that because you're a good talker, you're a good communicator, since listening is the primary communication skill. Listen to the whole person, not just the words. Everyone comes with a history, a context, sometimes uncharitably referred to as baggage. Their backstory is a crucial part of who they are. The more you listen, the more you can see the bigger picture. And the body language is often more eloquent than the words. Apologise more freely. Once you get the hang of it, you'll find apologising can be transformative. To withhold an apology is to deny the obvious truth that you, just like the rest of us, are capable of error. To hurt or offend someone, even unintentionally, and fail to apologise is quite simply arrogant and insulting. Forgive more generously. Since being forgiven is possibly the most therapeutic of all the proofs that we are being heard and acknowledged, why would we ever withhold its healing power from each other? And always the payoff: when we forgive, we are no longer a victim. Assume that everyone you meet needs to be heard, whether that need is obvious or not, and will thrive on your undivided attention. Young or old, sharp or flat, rowdy or quiet, from the toddler struggling to be understood to the person in a dementia ward who seems unresponsive, everyone we encounter plays a role in our life, and their voices all deserve to be heard as distinctly as our own. Chapter 4. Cynicism and indifference mock kindness. Tension and conflict can be creative. Cynicism is always destructive. When I hear the words lifelong learning, I reach for my gun. The speaker, believe it or not, was a retired educationist, and she and I were among a diverse group of people attending a meeting called many years ago by a member of the medical faculty at an Australian university. The purpose of the meeting was to explore ways of incorporating more material about ethics into the medical curriculum, and the conversation had turned to the need to ensure that doctors were constantly reminded of ethical and other professional, as opposed to clinical, issues throughout their career, not just in med school. I was there because I had just written a book called Right and Wrong: How to Decide for Yourself. Someone commented that this kind of teaching, alongside accumulated clinical experience, should be part of a doctor's lifelong learning. And that's when the cynical educationist spoke up. Her comment was a parody of the remark, "When I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun," variously and mistakenly attributed to one of the Nazi leaders, Himmler, Goebbels or Goering, but actually created by the German playwright Hans Jost in his pro-Nazi play Schlagetter, where the original line was, "When I hear the word culture, I release the safety catch on my Browning." At our little meeting, a few people laughed politely, but it was clear that some of the medical academics were not at all amused. One pointed out that doctors, of all people, need to be constantly learning to keep abreast of medical research and changes in clinical practice. Another reminded us that to keep their medical registration, doctors have to undergo continuing medical education to gain the requisite CPD, continuing professional development, points. Who, after all, would want to be treated by doctors who were not abreast of the latest developments in their field? Who would want to deal with doctors who thought that what they had learned in medical school was all that needed to be known? The educationist made no further contribution to the meeting, and having landed her one cynical blow, left soon afterwards. I knew something of her reputation. She was said to be so deeply cynical that some people questioned whether she was seriously interested in education at all, though she had forged a career out of it. She was regarded as a brilliant theoretician, but she was known to be dismissive of practical strategies to enhance the learning process. In fact, she regarded learning as a concept so inferior to the more high-flown education that she was disdainful of those whose main concern, as in medical education, was with the quality of teaching and learning. I suppose I'd encountered plenty of cynics before that, possibly not recognising their cynicism quite as sharply as I did on that occasion. That was certainly the first time I had fully realised what a corrosive effect cynicism can have, and what a desolate island it is to find yourself marooned on.
Lydia is inducted and shocked by a cynic. After taking a couple of years off work to complete a postgraduate degree, Lydia was as excited as a teenager to be offered a job in a government organisation in an urban renewal sector, where she felt her skills would be a perfect fit. She was a shameless idealist, always had been, and was looking forward to working in a place where she assumed terms like the common good and social responsibility and civil society would be taken seriously. For the first time in her life, she felt as if she might have found her vocation. She had been encouraged by all three of her job interviews, the last with Beatrice, the woman who would be her immediate boss. All those discussions had reassured her that this was the right place for her to be. She revelled in the idea of working on public policy, and no one had flinched when she talked about her desire to make a difference. Her previous job with a property developer had been awful. It was grindingly tedious work. She felt like a glorified clerk, and the whole enterprise was solely driven by the profit motive. She knew that any commercial organisation had to be profitable to be viable, but she had hoped it would be there in the background, rather than front and centre in every strategic discussion she ever had. New job, day 1, 9 o'clock on the dot. Lydia was waiting in the reception area for a man called Brad, a soon-to-be colleague at the same level as Lydia, who was to induct her into the organisation and show her around. Brad arrived at 9:10 and seemed surprised that Lydia was already there waiting for him. "No one gets in on time, Liddy. Can I call you Liddy?" So that's the first thing to know. Never make an appointment with anyone before 10 in the morning or after 4 in the afternoon. I don't mean those are our hours, it's just that we like to build a bit of flexibility into the system. Now, let's see. I'd better start at the top. The chair is located on the top floor, where else? And he uses this place as his personal office. But he's on so many boards, he's never around much after lunch. The CEO is up there too, but he's a mere cipher. He only got the job because he was an acolyte of the chair in another organisation where he'd, unsurprisingly, run out of career options. There was no formal application process. The chair fixed it for him, so we assume he's prepared to do the chair's bidding. The chair holds the reins, believe me. Not that he has the remotest interest in urban renewal, but he's very interested in power. Anyway, we'd better start with HR. If they haven't got a file for you, you don't exist. Lovely people up there, by the way, but most of them don't know their ass from their elbow when it comes to the real world. There's a bit of that about, in fact. Part of the charm of the place, as you'll discover. Shaken by Brad's breezy cynicism, Lydia, no one ever called her Liddy, tried to approach the HR department with an open mind. The person she dealt with was pleasant, efficient, warm, and engaging. "Welcome to our world," she said to Lydia when the paperwork was all done. "What a lovely woman," Lydia said to Brad as they got into the lift to return to the floor where Lydia would be working. "Oh, Jean? All charm, I agree. Not a lot between the ears, though, so she's in the right place. Let's go out for coffee. It'll be easier for me to fill you in if we're not overheard." What followed was a series of character assessments of the other people working in Brad's section. If not actually defamatory, they were so blunt and so uncomplimentary that Lydia felt obliged to speak in the people's defence, even before she'd met them. "Well, they can't be that bad, Brad," she said, in what she hoped was a light tone. "This place does good work, important work. I'm looking forward to it. Don't spoil it for me before I've got my feet under the desk." Brad gazed at her for a moment, as if to check she was serious. Were you ever a school prefect by any chance, Liddy? I was, as a matter of fact. Why do you ask? You'll meet a few kindred spirits here. Overachievers. That you? Oh, wouldn't go that far, but I regard the work of this organisation very highly. That's why I applied for the job. Good luck. Place is crammed with manipulators and opportunists. Highly competitive. Why do you stay, Brad? Lydia could hardly believe she was asking him that within an hour of their first meeting. But her blood was beginning to boil, and she couldn't help herself. Sweetest job I've ever had. Surrounded by you lot. I don't want to climb the greasy pole, but I love watching other people give it a go. As they returned to the building, Brad said the one thing Lydia had hoped he wasn't going to say. Beatrice, just watch her, okay? Don't trust her. She's an old maid of the CEO. They were both going nowhere in that other place, and she's in the pocket of the chair too. When I say in the pocket, that's all I mean, by the way. Not the bed, just the pocket. She has this job entirely due to him. She's unqualified and barely competent, but she looks good. She sounds good, and everyone knows she has a hotline to the chair. They talk every day. Every day. Needless to say, she'll take the credit for anything good you say or do. Worst possible situation, frankly, as far as we underlings are concerned. Anyway, here's your spot. Put your things down and let me introduce you around.
Later in this chapter, we'll revisit Lydia and see how she's getting on with Beatrice and Brad. For now, though, notice how cleverly cynics can position themselves as a bizarre combination of insiders who are nevertheless above the struggle. Smart, funny, fully informed, yet at the same time indifferent. I know this place inside out. I know all the gossip. I know where all the bodies are buried. I've seen it all before, and I have the great advantage of really not caring. My heart isn't in it, and I never pretend it is. But I'm so smart I get away with it. And when I have to, I know how to play the game. I can work the system better than anyone, precisely because I don't care. You can find cynics anywhere, in business, politics, the professions, the public service, academia, journalism, religion, and elsewhere. They may be intelligent, charming, fluent, and talented, but they typically show signs of deep insecurity and a wariness about engaging or cooperating with others. They often seem disappointed in themselves and inclined to project that disappointment onto others or onto the institution they work for. Cynics, like all of us, are the product of their formative years and all the experiences that have subsequently shaped them. Some people seem to be steeped in cynicism, cynics to their very core. Others seem more lightly tinged by it. Some seem to have adopted it as a self-protective affectation, others to have been driven to it by unhappy circumstances. And people might go through phases of cynicism that do not permanently define them as cynics.
This ends CD 4. CD 5.
So where does cynicism spring from? In some cases, a plausible explanation of its origins can be found in the attachment theory, first proposed by the British psychologist, psychiatrist and psychoanalyst John Bowlby in 1969. In an article summarising the evolution of the theory and the emerging research evidence to support it, American psychologists Matthew Dicus and Jude Cassidy point to the heart of attachment theory. From very early in life, children begin to understand whether or not they are being accepted, loved, valued, by attachment figures such as a parent or other primary caregiver. If young children perceive that they are not meant to be loved or valued, this might lead them to develop various defence mechanisms to protect themselves from the possibility of further rejection. As they proceed through life, such people will be reluctant to form close attachments to anyone, a romantic partner, a colleague, a friend, whom they might regard as capable of inflicting psychological pain on them. Better to remain guarded than to risk the possibility of further rejection. The main implication of attachment theory is that when very young children sense that they are securely loved and valued, this is the greatest bulwark against future behavioural problems, like cynicism, arising from emotional insecurity. If they feel securely attached in infancy, they will be more open to the possibility of forming secure attachments later. Research into this process shows that people suffering from attachment insecurity are more likely to perceive other people as untrustworthy and more likely to have negative perceptions of those closest to them, including their partner and their own children. They are also likely to become adept at forming loose attachments, possibly appearing quite gregarious, while having more difficulty with sustained intimacy. The absence of secure love in our formative years may well produce emotional damage from which we never quite recover. It's easy to see how some of the most cynical people we meet could well have suffered attachment anxiety and be using their cynicism as a defence against the potential pain of being rejected by family, friends, colleagues, or employers. Don't become too committed. Don't make yourself vulnerable. Those are typical of the cautionary messages cynics send themselves. Not all cynics would come into that category, of course, but it's worth remembering when we encounter cynicism that it might well be a symptom of a deep sense of woundedness. Plenty of dumped partners adopt a cynical attitude towards love and marriage, for example, at least until they fall in love again, and people let go from an organisation can be relied on to tell tales of the appalling bullying, intimidation, inefficiency, and incompetence that permeated the culture there. Some cynics, particularly the classic products of attachment insecurity, will need therapeutic assistance to help them deal with their wounds. But as long as their psychological defences are working, they might never see the need for such support, particularly if acerbic wit has become their hallmark. They might relish their capacity to amuse others and be perfectly happy to stick to that role. A lot of professional comedy runs on cynicism, whether real or affected, and the sad clown is an established stereotype in our culture. Others might have their cynicism thawed by the experience of sustained, unconditional love. Alternatively, they might move beyond their cynical phase, reassured by signs that they are acknowledged, understood, and appreciated after all. Whatever the origins of their cynicism, cynics typically believe they have been marginalised by the system, sometimes claiming to have been the victims of persecution or prejudice, or else they might have deliberately positioned themselves on the margin to insulate themselves from disappointment. They have a propensity for creating the sharpest barbs and an inability to restrain themselves from launching them. For the cynic, denigration and demolition come more easily than encouragement and positivity, which is why their effects on others can be so destructive. If our confidence, idealism, and hope are worn away by constant exposure to cynicism, our resilience is also likely to be undermined. In the spirit of kindness, it is possible to understand and be amused by the cynic. During the 2020-21 pandemic, in response to a journalist's question, I mentioned that people were tending to write longer emails because they were including warmer, more personal stuff, inquiring after other people's well-being and checking how they were coping with social isolation and other restrictions. Picking this up, The Squiz, an online daily news digest, commented, "Mark it down as another horror inflicted by this virus." Mildly amusing, perhaps, if meant ironically, but a perfect example of how the cynic operates. Take something positive, people caring about each other's well-being during a pandemic, and by mockery, turn it into a negative. Take something beautiful and make it appear ugly. Take something nobly meant and reposition it as mere sentimentality. Sentimentality, incidentally, is one of the favourite targets of cynics because, like kindness, it implies a level of emotional generosity alien to them. I've never known a happy cynic. Those I've met have all been miserable to some degree, sometimes misanthropic, hell is other people, and often bitter. I've never known a cynic to laugh uncontrollably. Their laughter somehow manages to convey the sneer that is the facial badge of the cynic. They are the classic practitioners of Schadenfreude, taking pleasure in the misfortune of others, because misfortune is what they typically wish on those who have done better than they might have done. While cynicism is mostly associated with disaffection, it can also be found in those who are driven by a passion for power, status, influence, and authority. If you aspire to be top for the sake of being top, whether that means Prime Minister, Chairman, Chief Executive, Principal, Director, Manager, or any other post that carries the connotation of top of the heap, then you are already trapped in the coils of cynicism. A person who declares, "I always wanted to be Prime Minister," rarely, if ever, completes that sentence by adding, "so I could reduce inequality," or "so I could right some of society's wrongs," or "so I could leave the world a better place than I found it." No, the ambition to be top is generally, quite nakedly, ruthlessly self-serving. It was what I wanted to be, not what I wanted to do. Of course, there are ambitious idealists too. For example, people who want to become school principals so they can implement some of their ideas for making the school a better environment for learning. Or people who aspire to become the factory manager because they can see ways of creating a more humane environment for the workers. There are many people who enter politics without asserting their personal desire for the top job because they mainly want to represent their electorate and possibly also help to make Parliament itself a more civilised and productive place. But the cynical pursuit of power for its own sake in any context is the dangerous one because it's a vanity project, often an agendaless project, usually in the end a self-destructive project. In fact, we should be wary of handing leadership positions to people who too desperately want them. As Plato remarked, only those who don't seek power are qualified to hold it. One of my favourite quotes of all time. The two most cynical people I have ever met, both men, happened to be of the ambitious cynic variety. In both cases, they had successfully manipulated institutions and organisations to get their hands on the power they sought and to place themselves beyond the reach of lesser beings who might inflict psychological pain on them. In both cases, incidentally, they lived with a wife disappointed by the life she had had to endure, with a husband who couldn't show enough affection, who was constantly holding back from abandoned commitment to the relationship because his energies and focus were elsewhere, who expected his wife to be amused by his scorn for everyone around them, except insofar as they might serve his purpose. But most of the cynics I've met have either lacked ambition or, more likely, concealed their ambition beneath a veneer of contempt for the very pathway that might have brought them more satisfaction if they had followed it. In that way, cynicism is often the handmaiden of indifference. If I have failed to achieve what I had originally hoped for, I might try to disguise my disappointment by indifference to the very idea of achievement or advancement. Having failed to be acknowledged or adequately rewarded by the system, I will affect disdain for the system itself and for those who march to its drum. Cynic used to mean something very different. If you're interested in how words change their meaning over time, cynic is a classic case. It was once a serious school of philosophical thought, strongly influenced by Socrates, and in turn a strong influence on the later Stoics. The Cynics of ancient Greece were committed to the idea that virtue was the key to happiness or eudaimonia. They were initially led by Antisthenes, an Athenian who claimed to be proud of his wealth, although he had no money, because he was satisfied with what he had and could survive in whatever circumstances he found himself. Antisthenes, like Socrates, believed the soul was more important than the body and was prepared to neglect the body for the sake of the soul. This led eventually to the embrace of asceticism, as championed by Diogenes, who, appalled by corruption, lived in a wine cask and ate whatever scraps of food he could find. The label cynic was derived from the Greek word for dog. Diogenes was seen as being as shameless as a dog. One story describes him going about in daylight holding a lamp, looking for an honest human. Diogenes wanted to replace the debased standards of society with the genuine standards of nature, that is, living with the minimum humans need to sustain life. American philosopher Harry A. Ide notes that cynicism was an active branch of philosophy throughout the 3rd century BCE and reappeared in the 2nd century CE with its core ideas intact, that self-sufficiency is the key to happiness and asceticism the key to self-sufficiency. So, cynicism was once a rather severe prescription for resilience. Be satisfied with what you have. Virtue is the pathway to happiness. Does that sound like today's cynics? How the world and the word has changed. Today's cynics. In contemporary English-speaking countries, cynic now has a far more derogatory connotation as captured in the Oxford English Dictionary. A person disposed to rail or find fault, one who shows a disposition to disbelieve in the sincerity or goodness of human motives and actions, and is wont to express this by sneers and sarcasm, a sneering fault-finder. It's not a pretty list, is it? And perhaps we could add the word contemptuous to it, since that's one of the characteristics of cynics that makes them socially destructive. To regard others with contempt is to erect a barrier against the free flow of kindness and respect, those twin ingredients of a civilized society. Cynics like to position themselves as being superior but disengaged, as if they exist in a state of lofty indifference. Yet that's a position that has consequences for the rest of us. Cynics, by their very indifference, make it more likely that their misanthropic view of the world will be confirmed. If enough people withdraw to the sidelines to mock and sneer, who will play the game? The cynic might enjoy feeling marginalised because the margin is like a grandstand from which to observe the folly of humankind. Yet, being a mere bystander is exactly what is not needed for the building up of social cohesion, for the creation of social harmony, and for making the world a better place. Better to stumble while trying to contribute something useful than to contribute nothing at all. Then again, idealism is another of the things cynics like to sneer at. The most extreme act of cynicism must be murder, the ultimate expression of contempt for another person, including their right to life. But any physical violence is a form of cynicism that says, I am the centre of my world, you are annoying me, I attach no value to you, now cop this. Infidelity, in love, in business, or in any other setting, is a form of cynicism that says contemptuously, I will place my own interests above yours. I am in this for myself. I sneer at your talk of fidelity. That's just you trying to impose your own standards on my behaviour. Arrogance is a form of cynicism that says, I am smarter than most people. I get the way the world works. I can make it work for me. Cynicism is the polar opposite of kindness, though it sometimes comes in genteel disguise, like the idea of instrumental virtue, doing the right thing because it will make you feel better. We touched on this idea in Chapter 2, but it's worth revisiting here. It's a particularly slippery form of cynicism because it amounts to using the needs of others as a way of boosting our own self-esteem, and it totally misses the point of virtue, altruism, and kindness, which is that we simply owe these things to each other because, as members of the same species, we belong to each other. A point most religious, mystical, and spiritual traditions have been trying for millennia to reinforce. Cynics generally believe they would be better off if they avoided unpleasant or unsympathetic people, if they surrounded themselves with a circle of like-minded people they could rely on to shield themselves from psychological pain. If you think of doing good as a pathway to feeling good, then you might well want to avoid too much unpleasantness in your life in case it makes you feel unpleasant. This is like proposing to live in the security of an emotional bubble that insulates you from the complex reality of human experience, including its nastiness, its petty jealousies, its ruthlessness, its misery, and its despair, to say nothing of the negative people who might be the very ones in the greatest need of your compassion and patience. The cynic has no time for any of that. A problem shared is a problem doubled, is a particularly cynical remark. Weekend Australian magazine columnist Nikki Gemmell spells it right out. Those friends who don't spark joy, ditch them. Slide away from their world, especially the ones who don't lift you but diminish you in some way. The same view is expressed with equal force by Julia Baird in her 2020 bestseller Phosphorescence. Describing competitive, gossipy people, along with jerks and bullies, Baird urges us to run from such people. Seriously, run. Instead, she recommends that we carefully draw the brilliant, the decent, and the good-hearted near and love them fiercely. Shed the toxic and the small. Show loyalty and honour to those you love. Now on a roll, she goes on to say, there are millions of excellent humans on the globe. Find them, befriend them, support them. Baird's prescription stands in the ancient Jewish tradition where love your neighbour referred literally and exclusively to people like us, people who share our culture, people who are part of our in-group. But there's an entirely different philosophical tradition expressed in the so-called Golden Rule, treat others as you would have them treat you, and endorsed in the teachings of people as diverse as the Buddha, Jesus, Marcus Aurelius, and Bertrand Russell, but perhaps made most explicit in Christianity's famous quote from the so-called Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. In that spirit, illustrated in the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan, neighbour includes everyone, even those we don't like much, could never agree with, would never become friends with, but who nevertheless form part of the human family to which we all belong. For that reason alone, such people are entitled to be treated kindly and respectfully, knowing that an inclusive, generous approach is the only pathway to social harmony. In fact, the troubled, unpleasant people Baird and Gemmell urge us to run away from might be the very ones in need of our sympathetic and patient understanding, whether or not they happen to spark joy in us. Engage and listen, don't run, unless, of course, you are in a toxic situation you need to escape from. We don't learn to be resilient by removing the nasty stuff from our lives. We don't learn humility by mixing only with people who love and support us. Naturally, we cherish the emotional comfort and support of those who do love us, but their love is like a resource that equips us for dealing kindly with the unlovely. Imagine what a miserable place the world would be if we were kind only to people who were kind to us. Radical, revolutionary kindness is not interested in reciprocity and doesn't keep score of kindnesses given or received. The title of this chapter brackets cynicism with indifference. They don't always seem like bedfellows, but each can easily lead to the other. Cynicism is a distancing state of mind, and indifference can morph into cynical indifference in the blink of an eye. If I don't care about you, about the organisation I work for, about the neighbourhood I live in, then cynicism lurks as a real possibility. Not caring is tantamount to disengagement, and it's a short step from disengagement to that sneering denigration that refuses to believe in the value of other people. And, of course, it can also work in the opposite direction. Because I don't believe in the value of people, in their potential for goodness, why should I bother getting involved with them? Cynics exert a particular influence on our world by their refusal to engage with the joys and sorrows of others' lives, by their discouraging tendency to sneer, by their brooding disbelief in the possibility of others' worth. As a footnote to this discussion, it's worth drawing the distinction between the cynic and the skeptic. Whereas the cynic denigrates, mocks and belittles, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of goodness and nobility in others, the skeptic is a person reserving judgment, waiting for more evidence before committing one way or another. Agnostic, not yet convinced. Like the cynics, the original skeptics were also a school of ancient Greek philosophy. Their distinctive position was to doubt the possibility of real knowledge of any kind. They believed certainty about anything was unjustifiable. Today's skeptics generally don't go that far. They are open to the possibility of knowledge and certainty, they just haven't got there yet. Skeptics can be irritatingly demanding in their persistent questioning, but as genuine seekers after truth, they are important contributors to the life and culture of any society. Unlike the cynics, they have no desire to denigrate or destroy the social fabric, but only to question the quality or the pattern of its weaving.
Lydia attends her first and last off-site. Settling into her new job, Lydia found she liked her colleagues well enough. Even Brad was entertaining, but she simply couldn't shake off the negative impression she had been given by Brad's induction, and she had found herself looking for signs that would confirm what he had told her. She wished it were otherwise. Oh, how she wished she could have come into the job untarnished by all that gossip and innuendo. Beatrice, who had seemed so wonderfully high-minded at Lydia's final interview, continued to sound impressive. She was certainly right on top of the jargon, but Lydia couldn't help noticing cracks in her facade. And, sure enough, when Lydia had prepared her first research paper on a radically new approach to street furniture, Beatrice had whisked it away and apparently passed it off in a senior management meeting as the fruits of her own thinking. Lydia learnt this via Brad, who seemed to have contacts everywhere. But would she have attached any significance to any of this if Brad hadn't created a particular lens for her? It was the same with her colleagues. Having had the benefit, or the disadvantage, of Brad's briefing, Lydia was hyper-alert to any signs of inadequacy or incompetence, and, though she didn't regard herself as an arrogant person, she was surprised by her own reaction when she encountered something she thought was a bit inefficient. She was almost pleased to see that Brad had been right. The clincher for Lydia, in a bad way, was a one-day strategy meeting for her work group, to be held in the conference centre of a regional council's offices, just beyond the fringe of the metropolitan area. Everyone seemed excited about the event and kept referring to it as the off-site, as if being held away from the office was the main thing to be said about it. They all travelled to the location in a bus, and it had the air of a children's outing. Several people tried to crank up some community singing, which fell very flat very quickly. The purpose of the day's proceedings was to define the purpose of the group's work. This had puzzled Lydia from the start. If we don't understand the purpose of what we're doing, then why are we doing it? She raised this with a couple of her colleagues, but they seemed caught up in the idea that a bit of blue sky thinking was just what was needed. A clearer sense of strategic direction, a firmer grasp of the parameters, one had said. There's a whole range of issues to be aired, said another vaguely. Only Brad shared Lydia's doubts, and she wished she had a different kind of ally. But the morning tea and lunch will be excellent, Brad had assured her, himself a veteran of many off-sites. The day was as puzzling as Lydia had feared it might be. Beatrice seemed to be mouthing platitudes, and people were locked in earnest discussion about meaning and purpose, matters that Lydia thought could be taken for granted, given the nature of their work and the fact that, back at the office, they were all busily engaged in actual concrete projects with as clear a purpose as Lydia could imagine. Beatrice had warned everyone that the chair will pop in. Sure enough, just before lunch, he swept into the conference room, whispered something to Beatrice, then turned to the group seated at tables arranged in a hollow square. Later, Lydia struggled to recall exactly what the chair had said, but it was along the lines of what a good thing it is to ponder the purpose of our work and thereby gain a clearer sense of direction. At one point, she did recall quite clearly he had said that what the organisation needed was good people, good young people. And then he was gone. The off-site was scheduled to end at 4. At 3:30, when it was clear that nothing definitive or imaginative was going to emerge, Beatrice declared that this had been a most productive and illuminating session, and that the group should use the remaining 30 minutes to try to articulate the key questions that remained unanswered. The group came up with 6. Top of the list, proposed by Brad of all people, was this one. What are we trying to achieve? Beatrice applauded that as incisive and challenging. On the return bus journey, Lydia was in despair. She had found herself unable to contribute anything useful and had frequently found herself wondering whether all the talk had really meant anything to anyone. Again, she wondered whether her view of the whole enterprise had been tarnished by Brad's initial briefing. She feared that she herself was becoming cynical. She was keen to continue with her street furniture project, but she was losing confidence in her colleagues' ability to grasp the value of it. On Monday morning, she ran into Brad in the lift going up for lunch. Brad was gazing at her with an amused air. So, the offsite. What did you think? Didn't I tell you? Tell me what? The lunch. Terrific, didn't you think? And the bickies for morning tea were right up to scratch. What more can you ask of an offsite? Progress? Lydia ventured. Ha! Not when it's in the hands of Beatrice. You know her problem by now, don't you? She's entirely cynical. This is just a job for her. And the chair is equally cynical. We're here to enhance his reputation and satisfy his ambition. We're his good young people. Good in the sense of making him look good. By the way, I saved this for you. It was in the Weekend Oz. Brad handed Lydia a newspaper cutting and walked off. It turned out to be an advertisement for an urban planning job in a regional city. Less money than she was earning now, but more heft. Within a month, Lydia had got the job and was gone, buoyed by the reassurances she had been given that the city councillors loved her ideas on street furniture and couldn't wait for her to get started. Brad wished her well and started to tell her something he'd picked up about corruption in the local government offices where she would be working. She held up her hand. No thanks, Brad. I'll be a blank slate this time. Suit yourself, Brad said. If it doesn't work out, Beatrice will welcome you back with open arms, you know. She's never looked as good as when you were doing her thinking for her. Oh, and I'll still be here. I have 14 years, 5 months and 11 days to early retirement, and some very generous super. When she looked back on her time working for the Urban Renewal Agency, Lydia often puzzled over Brad. If he was such a cynic, how come he was caring enough to show her that job vacancy? She reminded herself that no one is ever just one thing.
Kindness and hope. The twin vaccines against cynicism. It's hard to know whether Charlie Mackessy's The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse is a book for kids or grown-ups. Mackesy himself says it's for people from 8 to 80 and confesses that he sometimes feels like both. That reminded me of the ancient Chinese wisdom of Mencius. The great man is the one who doesn't lose his child's heart. Sometimes the book seems quite sophisticated. One of our greatest freedoms is how we react to things. Sometimes it makes me cringe. Asking for help isn't giving up, it's refusing to give up. Sometimes I just nod in furious agreement. The greatest illusion is that life should be perfect. But I was taken by this exchange. What do you want to be when you grow up? This is the mole asking the boy. Kind, said the boy. My youngest grandchildren are at the stage where they enjoy speculating about what they want to be when they grow up. One has stuck pretty consistently to the ambition to become a vet. Another swings wildly from animal rescuer to stormtrooper. Until I read Mackesy, it hadn't dawned on me to suggest to them that kind might be the greatest aspiration of all, far more significant in the scheme of things than having this or that job. When I was a kid myself, I was constantly asked that same question: what do you want to be when you grow up? I never had a convincing answer. If I'd just been to the dentist, I might say dentist. If I'd just come home from school, I might say bus driver. If I'd just been to church, I might say minister. Later, as I rose through the ranks of the school cadet corps, boots agleam, I'd say army officer. But I never thought to say kind. And I wish I had. I wish I had known to say that. But of course I missed the point of the question, and so I'm sure did most of my questioners, which is not what do you want to do, but what do you want to be? Different thing entirely. Yet we spend so much of our lives defining ourselves by what we do, our job or career, or where we went for our last trip, or what happened to us last Thursday, that we rarely confront that childhood question, what do you want to be? Later in life, a minor variation can still be worth asking. What are you becoming? And is this what you want to become? If you tell me you're a merchant banker, I will fight to keep my prejudices at bay and probe to get some idea of your inner life, the kind of person you are, the values you hold. None of that is automatically determined by the label merchant banker. If you tell me you're an atheist, I'll want to know how that is relevant to the way you live, and whether it makes you a better person than if you were, say, a Hindu or a Mennonite Catholic. Are you kinder, more loyal, more compassionate, more courageous, more loving, because you're an atheist? Your set of beliefs, whether they spring from atheism or devout Christianity, are of far less significance than how you lead your life, how you treat other people, especially those who strongly disagree with you, how interested you are in contributing to the common good. The cynic, by definition, is less interested in contributing to the common good than in mocking and belittling the efforts of those trying to do so. If there's one thing that could save the cynic from cynicism, it might be the realization that kindness is not a soft option, but the expression of a hard-headed commitment we need to make if we are to engage with the project of building a stronger community and, in turn, a better society. If we were all cynics, what a dreary, heartless place the world would be. What an emotional desert we would create if we all remained indifferent to the state of the world, or the state of the nation, or the life of the neighbourhood, or the culture of the organisation we work for. Or worse, if we took pride in our indifference and wished everyone else would dial back their passion and idealism and just cool it. Some cynics are a lost cause. We're unlikely to inspire a person cocooned by indifference to embrace kindness as their guiding principle, or to accept that a kinder disposition could lift them out of their pit of despair by switching their focus from the state of the self to the well-being of others. If you've read this far into this chapter, I think I can assume you're not a lost cause, so it's not a waste of ink to suggest that a commitment to kindness as a way of life will act as a vaccine against the ravages of cynicism. It's impossible to be routinely kind to people and at the same time be insulated from them. It's impossible to smile and sneer all at once. It's impossible to sink into cynicism when we know that today or tomorrow someone will need our encouragement or support, and that mocking them for their frailty won't be of much help. Creative tension can be generated by robust disagreements, respectful resistance to each other's ideas, and a willingness to argue over points of disagreement between us. Indeed, that kind of engagement builds our resilience. Conversely, a failure to engage with such contests will undermine our resilience, will reduce the prospect of renewal in a relationship or a society, and could be a worrying symptom of creeping indifference. Cynicism is a form of despair, and despair is the antithesis of hope. The cynic doesn't want the world's ills cured. The worse things become, the more the cynic's gloomy prognostications are confirmed. Bad news is therefore good news, and good news merely a temporary blip on the cynic's darkening horizon. As with kindness, I'm not naive enough to suggest that we can grab cynics by the collar and instill some hope into them by shouting, pleading, cajoling, ridiculing, or offering our clearly superior worldview. Cynics, like any of us, might change their minds quite unexpectedly at a moment when someone enters their life and inspires them, perhaps via love, with new possibilities or a more realistic point of view, or when some other disruption to their life shocks them out of indifference. Not all cynics are pessimists, but the correlation is pretty high. The pessimist says the glass is half empty, the optimist says the glass is half full, the realist says the glass is twice as big as it needs to be. Cynics may think of themselves as realists, but all they can see in the glorious trajectory of human history is misery, failure, corruption, pointlessness, and folly. And yes, there's plenty of all that, but it hasn't prevailed, or we wouldn't be here today, exploring ways we might do better from here on. If you've managed to save yourself from cynicism thus far, then you probably already know that hope is the other crucial ingredient in the vaccine you'll need to inoculate yourself against it. Kindness keeps your focus on the needs of others, and that's usually the best protection against anxiety as well as cynicism. And hope keeps your focus on the prospect of a brighter future for us all. Writing in The New Yorker, the American neurologist Oliver Sacks said this: "To live on a day-to-day basis is insufficient for human beings. We need to transcend, transport, escape. We need meaning, understanding, and explanation. We need to see overall patterns in our lives. We need hope, the sense of a future." During World War II, when the Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl was enduring the horrors of life in a Nazi concentration camp, he observed that prisoners who had lost their faith in the future, their hope, were doomed. The Christian tradition, like most spiritual traditions, places great emphasis on hope. In his letter to the church in Rome, St. Paul wrote that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. In another of his letters, Paul set out the famous Faith, Hope and Charity trilogy, more recently translated as Faith, Hope and Love, which you'll have heard read out at practically every wedding ceremony you've ever attended. Love works beautifully at weddings, but the original charity comes a bit closer to our idea of kindness. In fact, if you substitute kindness as the key word in that oft-quoted chapter of the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, it reads rather like a manifesto for the kindness revolution, right from the first verse. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. That's a poetic way of reminding us that if we lack kindness, all our fine words are just so much hollow noise. Paul brackets faith, hope and love, kindness, together because those qualities are indeed the threefold pathway to mental and spiritual health. Faith in something greater than ourselves, hope for a better future, kindness towards others. It's a magic formula that has endured. The most secular of contemporary psychologists will come up with minor variations on that same trio as the safest prescription for maintaining our sanity by enriching our sense of meaning and purpose. Needless to say, Shakespeare understood the power of hope. True hope is swift and flies with swallows' wings. Kings it makes gods, and meaner creatures kings. Hope as rocket fuel, hope as the enhancer, hope above all as the banisher of cynicism and despair. The same idea is echoed in these lines by Wordsworth. Through love, through hope, and faith's transcendent dower, we feel that we are greater than we know. Lose hope, and despair will rush in to fill the vacuum. Lose hope, and your love becomes an empty shell. Lose hope, and before long you'll hear the voice of the cynic out of your own mouth. And the basis for hope? If your own brand of faith doesn't supply it, then let it rest on the impressive history of humans' ability to bring themselves back from the brink of chaos and disaster. We are good at surviving. We are the great adapters. We are born to love. Invest your hope in that. Alternatively, you could line up with Lord Byron in a letter he wrote to Thomas More. What is hope? Nothing but the paint on the face of existence. The least touch of truth rubs it off, and then we see what a hollow-cheeked harlot we have got hold of. Take your pick. Cynicism is a social cancer that also attacks the cynic, so there are strong grounds, personal as well as societal, for resisting its temptations. Here are 3 points to ponder. Humility is the key to greatness for individuals and societies. If we aspire to true greatness, there is no place for sneering cynicism. We need to admit our vanities, our vulnerabilities, and our inherent frailty. Greatness in a person, a leader, a team, an organisation, a society, is always marked by humility. Humility is the greatest human virtue because qualities like courage, compassion, integrity, restraint, tolerance, and resilience flow from it. The famous tall poppy syndrome is an attack not on greatness, but on arrogance. Mock humility is the worst form of cynicism. Because it is a sham, no matter how well practiced, it's always ultimately exposed, and then it simply looks ridiculous. Kindness drives out arrogance. The common byproduct of cynicism is arrogance, and that has been the undoing of prime ministers, sporting heroes, leaders in commerce and industry, cultural icons, school principals, brilliant academics, and assorted geniuses. Kindness keeps our focus on the needs of others, and that's like a vaccine, protecting us from the hazards of self-absorption, especially arrogance. All of us have good reason to be humble. That's worth remembering when the twin lures of cynicism and indifference attract us. To be indifferent to society's woes is to add to them. The last thing we need is indifferent citizens, indifferent neighbours, indifferent colleagues. To be cynical is to be self-absorbed and self-protective. And how does that serve the common good? Chapter 5. How Institutions Hold Us Together. Like any construction project, society needs its scaffolding for stability and protection. When disaster strikes, whether a pandemic, fire, cyclone or flood, or a more personal trauma like a bereavement, bankruptcy, retrenchment, sudden illness or relationship breakdown, it's tempting to feel as if life has been derailed, as if this is somehow not right, as if we should have been able to do something to avert it. At such times, the seductive fantasy that we are meant to live in a haven of tranquility and prosperity may be replaced by the equally unhelpful thought that if there are any fates, then they are unkind, and if there aren't any, then we are the victims of mere happenstance or cosmic caprice. In fact, life is not as accidental as it sometimes appears, though since a surprising number of pregnancies, especially first pregnancies, are unplanned, life itself began as an accident for many of us. Nor are we as free as we sometimes fondly imagine. Our capacities are ultimately determined for us by our DNA, and we are all subject to the limitations of human biology. We can't fly like birds, for instance, no matter how much we might wish we could, or how often we might manage it in dreams. We can't swim like fish or run like cheetahs. We can't time travel. We can't make ourselves invisible. We're only human after all. The limitations imposed on us by our genetic inheritance, height, sex, cognitive capacity, certain aptitudes, are largely beyond our control. Yet one of our characteristics as humans has always been that we impose other limitations on ourselves quite voluntarily to ensure that our communities, our societies, will endure and that they will function in as orderly and harmonious a way as possible. Although we often feel ourselves to be independent, we know that in practice we are all interdependent. We utterly rely on families, neighbourhoods, schools, faith communities, workplaces, assorted clubs and associations and other groups to sustain and nurture us and to give us the all-important sense of belonging that helps to define who we are and how we fit into society. And we rely on others to help us out of trouble. Who wouldn't call on their neighbours in an emergency or seek legal or medical advice when they are confronted by problems they can't solve on their own? There's nothing like a health crisis to remind us of how dependent we are on others. Indeed, our healthcare professionals, like most professional and tradespeople, and emergency services such as fire, ambulance and police, operate as society's breakdown gangs, constantly on standby to offer help when matters ranging from a toothache to a flooded basement are beyond our personal control. Given our great need of each other, it's hardly surprising that throughout our history we have looked for ways to formalise some of the arrangements that help ensure a well-functioning, harmonious society. It would be nice to think that our capacity for kindness, coupled with a well-developed sense of fairness and justice, would be enough to maintain social harmony and ensure everyone's commitment to the common good. But we know that having the capacity for kindness doesn't guarantee that we will always act kindly, just as having a disposition towards goodness doesn't guarantee that we will always do the right thing by others. Even a conscious desire to be kind and good is sometimes overwhelmed by the desire to please ourselves. The ego can be a powerful adversary in the struggle to create a kinder world. And that's where institutions and conventions, moral, social, cultural, and legal, come in. Some in the form of simple customs that oil the machinery of social discourse, some expressing the shared values that underpin our way of life, some designed to preserve the traditions that we respect as our cultural antecedents. We create political institutions to pass laws that we hope will promote social harmony, equality, justice, fairness, prosperity and security, both personal and national. We create legal institutions to protect us by upholding and enforcing those laws and to safeguard the electoral process. We create religious institutions to promote kindness and compassion as a way of life. We create educational institutions to socialize our young, transmit our cultural, scientific, and intellectual heritage, equip them to contribute to our society, and encourage them to become the best they can. We create cultural institutions, museums, galleries, libraries, public broadcasters, to provide pathways for personal and social enrichment. In sport, we institutionalize the rules. Some business and professional groups institutionalize their codes of conduct. We are also bound by softer institutions, conventions, like table manners, or the way we greet each other when we meet. Such conventions are so implicit in our daily lives that their cultural significance barely registers with us most of the time. "Oh, I couldn't consider marrying him," said Jocelyn to a friend who had inquired how her new romance was going. "Too right-wing?" asked the friend, conscious of the centrality of politics in Jocelyn's thought and conversation and the intensity of her political prejudices. "Oh, yes, there's that. I suspect he's a closet conservative under that tatty leather jacket, but no, you should see the way he holds his knife, like a pencil. Dead giveaway." Is it conceivable that a person would judge another by the way they hold their knife? Certainly. And by the way they pronounce the letter H. And by whether or not they turn anything into anythink. At some primitive level, we rely quite heavily on apparently trivial cues to assess our level of affinity with each other and to establish whether we come from the same social tribe. Indeed, the making of such judgments is itself a convention. We all do it, though our prejudices, being shaped by our upbringing, differ widely from person to person. Depending on your point of view, a plummy accent or flat nasal vowels can equally be described as a dead giveaway. Social conventions hardly qualify as institutions on the grand scale of more concrete expressions of our culture like parliaments, universities and schools, hospitals, law courts, or places of worship. Yet, to borrow the metaphor Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky used for describing a teacher's role in the psychological development of a child, all conventions, including institutions, are rather like scaffolding around the project of building and maintaining a society. H.C. Nugget Coombs, founding governor of the Reserve Bank, among many other things, once wrote, "Institutions provide the context within which the drama of our personal lives is played out." Institutions are not the core of our society. They are not the stuff of life. That's our person-to-person relationships. They are simply its framework. Like scaffolding, they help to keep us safe while we get on with our lives. Shortly before he died, the conservative British philosopher Roger Scruton wrote, "We thrive on disagreement, but only if we do not also feel threatened by it. In every period of history, therefore, there have been opinions and customs that are dangerous to question, since they provide the firm foundations on which our disagreements rest. Whether religious or political, these established ways of thinking and acting have been protected by law and embedded in the educational curriculum and the daily customs of the people." Scruton bemoaned the erosion of respect for customs, conventions, and institutions, and in particular Britain's loss of a shared religion as a core of its social conventions. Though his attitudes were widely regarded as reactionary, his central point was valid. For any society to function effectively, there must be some shared values, attitudes, and beliefs expressed in its institutions and social conventions, or a fragmented individualism would eventually undermine social cohesion to the point of anarchy. The argument, of course, is over which values might continue to be shared, might endure as common ground during periods of radical social change and upheaval. We normally think of scaffolding as something that can be removed when a construction project is complete. In the case of a society, the project is never complete. Societies are like organisms that are constantly evolving and maturing, decaying and reviving, reforming and rejuvenating. So the need for the protection of institutional scaffolding never ends, as long as we continue to fall short of perfection. Conventions are not themselves immutable. Australia's constitution can be changed by referendum, though our respect for it inhibits us from fiddling with it. We have a proud history of saying no to all but the most pressingly reasonable claims for change. Laws can be changed by acts of Parliament. Sporting codes can agree to modify their rules. Religious doctrines can evolve in the light of new knowledge or insight. The subtleties of social etiquette can change over time. And there's one social convention that keeps changing. Language is the most basic convention of all. Because we are social beings, herd animals, we've always needed to communicate with each other. We can do that through eye contact, eyebrow movements, grunts, laughter, tears, sighs, smiles and frowns, through touch, whether affectionate or hostile, formal or informal, through posture, gestures and other subtleties of so-called body language. All those things are culturally conditioned. A shake of the head can mean agreement in one culture and disagreement in another. Baring your teeth at someone might be interpreted as a smile or a snarl. Laughter and tears are pretty universal signals, yet there's still plenty of scope for ambiguity. Laughter can be cruel and ironic, as well as expressing pleasure, excitement, or amusement, and there are tears of joy as well as grief. As usual, context is everything. At some point in human evolution, no one knows when, we developed the capacity for language. In The Language Instinct, the Canadian-American linguist Steven Pinker argues that language is an evolutionary adaptation like the eye, designed to carry out important functions. Central to those functions, of course, is the ability to communicate with more nuance and subtlety than we can manage with grunts, smiles, frowns, and gestures. Pinker sees language as a distinct piece of the biological makeup of our brains, rather than a cultural artifact that we learn in the same way as we learn to tell the time or read the sky for signs of approaching weather. Pinker is talking about hardware, the capacity for producing and processing language itself is obviously part of our biological makeup. We need vocal cords to be able to speak, for instance, and a particular kind of brain to formulate and interpret words. But our creation of software, in the form of distinct national, tribal, and regional languages, is clearly a cultural artifact. The music of speech, the rhythms, cadences, accents, rates of speech and tones of voice we employ is highly specific to cultures and is acquired rather like table manners or dress codes as part of the process of socialization. Quite apart from differences in vocabulary, syntax, and grammar, think about the differences between the speech music of Indians, Russians, Italians, Chinese, French, Swedes, and Australians. Even if you can't understand the words themselves, you can probably identify the speaker from any of those countries by their speech music alone. And the same goes for the more subtle differences between the accents of Americans and Canadians, or the regional differences within those two countries, if your ear is attuned to them, or Irish and Scots, or Australians from Longreach and Australians from Melbourne, or Melburnians from the eastern and western suburbs. Why would that be? And why would the kids at one end of a school playground have some speech mannerisms, argot, jargon, slang, that differ from kids at the other end, or from kids at another school just down the road? And why would every professional group, from theologians and surgeons to IT professionals and lawyers, develop their own forms of jargon, code, to facilitate communication between the members of the in-group, despite the fact that this can make it hard for them to communicate with those outside the cognoscenti, including their own clients? We went and saw the specialist yesterday. When we came out, we realized neither of us knew what she was talking about. The answer takes us to the heart of the language paradox. We use language, words and speech music, both to include and to exclude, to facilitate communication and to prevent it. We want to facilitate it between members of our own language community and prevent, or at least discourage, people from other language communities from understanding what we're saying, or more precisely what we mean by what we're saying. That's true whether it's two Spaniards talking in front of a Russian they want to exclude from the conversation, or two doctors discussing the condition of a patient lying on a hospital bed beside them. Language, being the repository of culture, is bound to keep evolving as the culture evolves, and part of that evolution is finding new ways of keeping cultural secrets by excluding outsiders. Within an apparently unified language community, the subtle inflection in the pronunciation of a particular word can fix a socio-cultural gulf between speaker and listener. As a researcher, I have to restrain myself from cringing whenever I hear people say research. The Franco-American philosopher, writer, and educator George Steiner notes in After Babel that accent is worn like a coat of arms, not just to exclude others who come from different, especially inferior, tribes, but also as a way of establishing instant recognition between people from the same tribe. Every language is a kind of code. The French speak French not only so they can understand each other, but also so that Italians, Germans, and English can't understand them, unless they bother to learn the language. Learning Spanish vocabulary and grammar alone doesn't reveal Spanish culture to you, which is why one of the 20th century's great translators, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, said, "We do not consider English and Spanish as compounded sets of easily interchangeable synonyms. They are two quite different ways of looking at the world, each with a nature of its own." As an example, he claimed that the subtlety of meaning that lies behind the word machismo simply could not be expressed in one equivalent word because there is no equivalent notion in English culture. Borges therefore thought that translation could actually enrich a text by adding a different cultural dimension to it. The problem of translation is compounded by the fact that language is itself a translation of the thoughts and feelings we are trying to express, often with great difficulty, in words. Next time you feel like saying to someone, "Why don't you say what you mean?" remember that the truthful answer might well be, "I'm trying to, but it isn't easy." When serious matters are at stake, it often isn't easy to say what we mean, at least at the first attempt. A further complication is that we keep changing the way we use words, the meanings we attach to them, and we keep inventing new ones to enrich the process of communication. Under the influence of IT, our everyday vocabulary has dramatically shrunk. There's not much scope for deathless prose in a text or tweet. At the same time, as John McWhorter has pointed out in The Atlantic, we are gradually reverting to simpler, childlike speech, especially in the recent addition of Y to words like pilly, a consumer of recreational drugs, or a party becoming yelly, or someone being homelessy, which might imply not yet permanently homeless, like homeless-ish.
This ends CD 5. CD 6.
Money printer go brrr is intended to convey the gist of quantitative easing in monetary policy, and my bad adapts the new childishness to an apology. As playground talk spreads, people have become peeps in some places, as in, "I'll just check with the marketing peeps." Next stop, peep, singular, just to keep etymologists on their toes. The trend is leading us to omit words we might once have thought quite useful in a sentence. "I believe in climate change because science" is an idiom that also appears in the title of Canadian linguist Gretchen McCulloch's book, Because Internet. The legitimate defence of all this is that language is a living thing, an ever-changing medium of expression, and the only thing that matters is that we should clearly express our meaning so others can understand what we're driving at. I guess I believe in climate change because science does that, but will it work for future generations? Don't grammar and syntax, what they, you may ask, have a role in ensuring that future readers will know what we meant back in 2021? Aren't they valuable social conventions too, at least when it comes to the written word, or at least when it comes to the written word in more or less permanent form? No wonder dictionary makers have such a hard time keeping up. We don't, after all, find the meaning of a word in a dictionary. We simply find out how people have used words in the past. Think of a dictionary as being rather like a museum of meanings. Think of what's happened to words you grew up with, like gay, random, or virtual. We might be a global village online, but geopolitically and culturally, we are as tightly bordered as ever, and language is the most impenetrable of those borders. Ask any refugee or immigrant how long it takes and what an intellectual as well as emotional struggle it is to master a new language as part of the process of unlocking a new culture, even when you're living in the midst of it. The idea of a universal language hasn't a hope. Just like individuals, societies and cultures think of themselves as being independent as well as interdependent. Language is our greatest feat of cooperation, yet even here we compete. The invention of Esperanto, an artificially constructed auxiliary language in the late 19th century, was a brave attempt to create a means of communication that would supplement culturally derived languages, but it never caught on, precisely for that reason. It lacked the cultural roots of a naturally evolving language. The more recent concept of a European Union has never led to a proposal for a unified European language. Indeed, the closer countries draw to each other in cosy political or economic arrangements, the greater the need to assert their distinctive cultural identity. And language does that more effectively than anything else. When they all speak English, for example at an international meeting, the accents still serve as crucial cues to cultural differences. Why we create institutions and what happens when they fail us. We bring institutions into being, or allow them to come into being, to do cooperatively and collectively things we can't do individually, like run a legal, educational or financial system, or indeed a government. We also create institutions to express and preserve the values we espouse or claim to espouse as a society, and in the case of religious, cultural and political institutions, we might even expect them to provide moral leadership. Today, in any Western liberal democracy, those values we espouse would include justice, fairness, gender equality, equality of opportunity, especially in education, the rule of law, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, free speech, and opposition to discrimination of all kinds. That's an impressive list, but sadly, our institutions don't always uphold all those things. Fairness and equality, for instance, have had a pretty rough time in some Western democracies, including Australia. And at various times in history, institutions have positioned themselves to oppose such lofty ideals as freedom. Witness the Spanish Inquisition. Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell's dissolution of the monasteries of England, Wales and Ireland, Nazi Germany's institutionalised mass murder of Jews, Poles, Romani and others, and more recently, US military actions in the notorious prisons of Abu Ghraib in Iraq and Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, apparently on the basis that for prisoners captured in the war on terror, the Geneva Conventions did not apply since this was not a conventional war. Throughout history and across the globe, law enforcement has occasionally been tarnished by the corruption or brutality of police officers, prison guards, or intelligence agents. Just like individuals, institutions can be corrupted by their own power, and to adapt Lord Acton's famous phrase, absolute power can corrupt them absolutely. Back in 1961, outgoing US President and former Army General Dwight Eisenhower warned the American people about the growing influence of the military-industrial complex, which he saw as an institution being corrupted by its own power. In a healthy parliamentary democracy, institutions should feel to us as if they are our representatives, our facilitators, our servants rather than our rulers or exploiters. This is why the institution of an impartial, apolitical public service is such a crucial part of the ideal cultural scaffolding for societies like ours. And it's why our disappointment in institutions is so bitter whenever they behave as if they have forgotten the social license under which they are operating. When members of a parliament act as if they, rather than we, own that institution and trash its conventions by unparliamentary, childish, offensive, corrupt behaviour, we are disgusted, and our respect for them declines. When banks appear to forget that they exist only to serve the society that gave them a banking licence, for example by colluding to manipulate the bank bill swap rate, or by being complicit in the laundering of the proceeds of crime, or by shamelessly exploiting their customers, we become mistrustful of them and suspicious of their motives. When professional sporting bodies and players seem to be driven more by commercial imperatives than by the spirit of the game, we become understandably sceptical. When universities, the professions, or news media appear to be unduly influenced by commercial motives, we question their integrity. When religious institutions place their own interests ahead of the interests of the society they are supposed to serve, for example, by ignoring or covering up cases of sexual abuse, or seeking unfair tax or other financial advantages, or seeming more concerned with doctrine and self-preservation than with charity and service, those who had trusted them are not simply disappointed, they are outraged. Integrity, transparency, accountability. These are the three qualities we expect of any institution sanctioned by our society. Yes, in the case of commercial institutions like banks, we acknowledge that they need to make a reasonable profit in order to remain viable, but when the profit becomes unreasonable, we are understandably wary and feel justified in demanding transparent explanations. When an international organisation generates a significant profit from its Australian operations, we expect it to be accountable to Australian regulatory authorities and to pay appropriate taxes in Australia. When a private school or any non-government institution receives money from the public purse, we expect to be told exactly how it has been spent and indeed whether it was really needed. When already wealthy private schools receive public funding, that's a reasonable issue to raise. Integrity, transparency, accountability. When institutions seem to have retreated from these standards, our natural response is to look elsewhere. Yet we humans are notoriously inert when it comes to initiating change. We can be dissatisfied for years with our bank, yet stick with it. We can be appalled by the behaviour of an institutional church, but keep attending a local church of the same denomination. We can despair of the standard of news or current affairs reporting from a particular news organisation, but keep habitually buying its newspaper, watching its TV channel, or accessing its online platform. But sometimes we feel as if we've been pushed too far. When disillusionment sets in, we shrug off our natural inertia and start contemplating ways of disengaging from an institution that seems to have lost its legitimacy. For a complex set of reasons, trade union membership has steadily fallen, and many workers have resorted to individual contracts negotiated directly with employers. Newspaper sales are in long-term decline as people migrate to online news sources and indeed to social media for their news, or at least their conspiracy theories. Church attendance is declining, but the house church movement is gaining momentum. Political party membership is at an all-time low, and voters are increasingly prepared to swing or to consider switching their vote to minor parties or independent candidates, and even to debate alternatives to the present parliamentary system. Customers of the major retail banks are now starting to ponder the appeal of smaller regional, community or online banks, or non-bank alternatives like credit unions or other cooperatives. Old-style friendly societies could make a modest comeback. The transition of AMP in the other direction, from a once great mutual society to a fully corporatised public company serving the interests of its shareholders, has been a salutary lesson in the degeneration of a corporate culture that ultimately led to accusations of criminal behaviour in the 2018 Royal Commission into misconduct in the financial services industry. Disappointment and disillusionment can easily morph into disenchantment and anger. That's when an institution becomes the target of protests and riots, from Hong Kongers' demonstrations against China's growing influence over Hong Kong's parliament, to the protests that erupted in the United States, then globally, over the Minneapolis police murder of a black man, George Floyd, and quickly escalated into a nationwide protest against the general treatment of African Americans, Black Lives Matter, and other inequalities and perceived injustices in the very fabric of American society. In that case, the situation was complicated by the violence, arson, and looting widely attributed to extremists who were simultaneously responding to their own hate-filled agendas and trying to discredit the peaceful protesters. When the focus of disenchantment and anger broadens to embrace global issues like war, nuclear disarmament, species extinction or climate change, the process will typically spawn new social movements, some of which may morph into formal institutions. World War I led to the establishment of the League of Nations, World War II to the United Nations. In the 1960s, it was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Today, with the anger directed at governments and industrial enterprises for not recognising the urgency of the climate situation, and for knowingly pursuing policies that promote the continued emission of greenhouse gases on a huge scale. It's the militant Extinction Rebellion, or Australia's independently constituted Commission for the Human Future. Such movements deliberately operate outside the framework of existing institutions and construct their own rival scaffolding, grounded in social conscience and science, rather than commercial gain or political expediency. Ultimately, no institution, from a court to a church, from a school to a broadcaster, is safe from scrutiny by the people it is supposed to serve, nor should it be. They are the people who gave it its license to operate, the people who relied on the integrity of its scaffolding to support and protect their society and uphold its values. Institutions are supposed to minimise instability, not add to it. Institutional arrogance is as dangerous as any other kind. Online institutions? In the past 15 years, since the advent of Facebook, social media platforms have burgeoned to the point where they occupy a significant place in the daily routines of most people. In Australia, there are more than 15 million Facebook users out of a population of 25 million. The question is, have social media become part of society's scaffolding? Are they starting to fulfil or challenge the functions of traditional institutions, expressing and preserving a society's core values, allowing us to do collectively and cooperatively what we can't do individually, supporting our way of life, offering moral or cultural leadership? Have we yet handed power and authority to any online platforms in the way we have traditionally done to governments, courts, schools, hospitals, religious or financial institutions? The answer seems to be not yet, and perhaps not ever. At first glance, it might look as if online platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp have the potential to become institutions in their own right, but we'd need to stretch the definition of institution to accommodate them. It's hard to know quite what kind of institution they are becoming or replacing. A contemporary equivalent of the public forum, or the village square, or the town hall meeting? In some ways, WhatsApp resembles an online version of the informal and highly valued social institution we have historically called the grapevine, invisible but constantly humming with activity and regarded by its users as an irresistible source of information, rumour, gossip, news, real and fake, much of it personal and local in character. WhatsApp is the world's most popular instant messaging service, and its use surged during the COVID-19 pandemic. Located in the space between email, Facebook, and SMS texting, WhatsApp, itself owned by Facebook, allows texts, links, photos, and conversation to be exchanged between individuals and shared within groups. During the pandemic, the British political and sociological writer William Davies observed that WhatsApp had become a prime conduit through which waves of news, memes, and mass anxiety travelled. Writing for The Guardian, Davies argued that the privacy and security of WhatsApp make the platform potentially more dangerous than public social media because of the higher levels of trust and honesty that are often present in private groups, leading users to be less critical and more credulous about the material they encounter. As an example, he cites many families' use of WhatsApp during the pandemic for the circulation of unofficial medical advice that seemed to gain credibility for having been circulated within the family, even when it turned out to be patently wrong or misleading. The evolution of social media has been so rapid and their character so swiftly changing that it's hard to be sure what function they might provide in the long term and whether their social effects will turn out to be beneficial or harmful, or more likely both, to social cohesion and harmony. Facebook was initially hailed as a symbol of the global village, and Mark Zuckerberg as a potential folk hero in the mould of Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, who insisted that it be an open system freely accessible to everyone. When Zuckerberg effectively harnessed Facebook to the advertising industry, offering its commercial clients unprecedented insights into consumer attitudes and behaviour distilled from endless surveillance of its users, the platform began to seem more exploitative than supportive. At best, it may now be regarded as the equivalent of a commercial TV channel where the users themselves provide the program content, including news, and advertisers are able to target their messages to particular audiences with extraordinary precision. Less benignly, it can be seen as a surveillance system that sells information about its users' lives to commercial interests and potentially to unknown others. Twitter has become the favoured hunting ground for trolls, pile-ons, and other manifestations of the darker and more troubled aspects of human nature, graphically described by Ginger Gorman in Troll Hunting. Like Facebook, Twitter has also become a medium of propaganda, including personal aggrandizement, and is carefully deployed by political operators, commercial and cultural organisations, and social anarchists alike. Yet, social media are clearly filling the vacuum created by declining public trust and interest in traditional mainstream mass media. Although many users acknowledge that much of the material they consume on social media is of dubious origin, they continue to consume it because it's fun or addictive. Rather like consumers of junk food who know what potential damage they are doing to themselves but continue to consume it because it's nice or addictive. William Davies worries that WhatsApp supports communications on the margin of institutions and public discussion, and he fears that under the influence of the hidden activities of assorted manipulators, WhatsApp might foment gossip, secret plotting, and the circulation of rumours that fuel distrust, alienation, and conspiracy theories, and in turn chip away at the institutions that are holding us together. He also fears that social media platforms like WhatsApp will contribute to the decline in public respect for experts, specialists, officials, and politicians, as more people come to regard their own private sources of authority as a reference point for judging whatever experts might say. The idea of social media having the purity and simplicity of the people's medium is classic fantasy stuff. The reality is far murkier. It's more realistic to regard social media as no more than the servants of existing institutions, both legitimate and otherwise, rather than potential institutions in their own right. yet they are certainly a rich source of new and emerging social conventions. New social conventions post-pandemic. It's not only social media that are reshaping social conventions. In the wake of 2020's widespread social disruptions, many people worked from home either because their employer required it of them or because they accepted the argument that staying at home, except for essential trips to shops or medical appointments, was a gesture of care and kindness that would save lives. In that way, as I suggested in the prologue, the pandemic brought out the best in us. There was no doubt a strong element of self-interest operating as well. Stay home and save lives obviously implied including your own. Such a radical change to our way of living, if only for a period as short as 6 months, was always bound to have some long-term effects on our behaviour, especially our social conventions. The main thing we know about behaviour change is that it usually occurs in response to changes in our social or physical environment. We rarely act differently because of attitude change. We are most powerfully influenced by what actually happens to us. Change the environment, and you change the behaviour. You don't discourage people from smoking or drink driving or doing other destructive or antisocial things by pleading with them to behave differently. You change their behaviour by changing the conditions under which they behave, by the introduction of random breath testing, expanded no-smoking areas, increased product prices, and other direct interventions. In response to the pandemic, 2020 became a mass experiment in behaviour change, and the questions social scientists were asking themselves were, how many of these changes will stick? Will we become a little less enthusiastic about hugging and kissing everyone? That's a relatively recent phenomenon in Australia, and many of us are still taken aback when a person we've kissed on one cheek then proffers the other one. Will we shake hands less often and perhaps borrow a modified version of the Japanese bow? Will we be less inclined to use public transport? Or will public transport operators offer smaller vehicles and more frequent services to minimise the risk of overcrowding? Will the pandemic's bicycle revolution turn out to be permanent? Will all those rescue dogs acquired for emotional comfort before the lockdown continue to be cared for when life returns to normal, or will many of them find themselves back in the pound? And will life return to normal? Halfway through 2020, people became fond of talking about the new normal, as though to acknowledge that such a mass upheaval in our living arrangements was likely to have some enduring effects on us, and that simply going back to the previous way of doing things was not an option. Indeed, many people expressed the fervent hope that we wouldn't just return to the way things were, that we wouldn't just bounce back. Some people captured that idea in the slogan, "Bounce forward, not back." What had we learned from the experience of living through the pandemic? We had certainly reappraised the crucial role of government in managing public safety, and Australians being more socially responsible, some might say acquiescent, than people in some other countries, such as the United States, we welcomed those interventions and generally complied with the regulations. Some of us might have been surprised to hear politicians talking about our moral duty to comply with the restrictions, especially when they sensed we might be a bit less acquiescent in the face of a second lockdown, but most of us appeared to accept the appropriateness of a moral dimension being introduced into the debate. Neoliberal talk of small government and getting the government out of our lives faded. We wanted government in our lives not only to advise and direct us, but also to support the millions of us who were economically disadvantaged or even devastated by the crisis. Our faith in medical science was reinforced, since governments were clearly attentive to the advice of medical authorities, and many people hoped that this would extend post-pandemic to a new attentiveness to the messages coming from climate scientists as well. One barrier to such attentiveness is the strong countervailing pressure on governments coming from the fossil fuel industry, whereas there is no serious opposition from vested interests to the march of medical science. As mentioned in Chapter 1, we rediscovered the importance of the local neighbourhood in our lives and were reminded, in case we had forgotten, that this is where immediate help can always be found in an emergency. We made contact with neighbours we'd not previously met or paid much attention to. There were balcony choirs, including one in my own apartment block, birthday cakes baked and left on doorsteps, and a generally kinder, more sensitive attitude to the people we live among. In spite of the re-emergence of some old and ugly prejudices like racism and ageism, many of our social attitudes softened, not only towards the growing army of unemployed and underemployed people, but also towards those for whom social isolation is a permanent way of life, unlike the brief taste of it most of us had experienced during the lockdown. It remains to be seen whether that softening will be reflected in more sustained generosity towards the charities who care for the isolated, the poor, the homeless, those struggling with mental illness, refugees and people seeking asylum, and so on. It would be disappointing if that were not the case. And will the kindness revolution extend to a switch in government public housing policies, which might go so far as to eliminate homelessness? Finland has done it by the simple expedient of providing homes for homeless people, so they are in a secure housing situation from which they are better able to address the problems that led to their homelessness in the first place. Will it extend to the closure of our notorious offshore detention centres for the people seeking asylum who were unfortunate enough to arrive by boat? How do we justify that when we've never detained asylum seekers who arrive by air? When we feared that our food supply might be affected, or that a kind of dystopia might set in, we started to value more highly people whose work had previously been taken for granted. At least for a while, we became more grateful to farmers, to people who stock supermarket shelves, to online retailers, to garbage collectors. Our attitudes to non-essential travel were radically changed by the experience of COVID-19, particularly by the realization that international travel is a super efficient way of carting dangerous bugs around the globe. Medical authorities point out that the only reason SARS-2, aka COVID-19, became a pandemic on a global scale while the SARS-1 epidemic did not, is that in the intervening years, cheap airfares had facilitated exponential growth in international travel. In the wake of the pandemic, many older people declared that they had made their last overseas trip. The social convention that travel is good had been challenged. Ultimately, we may expect that international air travel will need to be justified, not only because of its disease-spreading potential, but also because of its negative environmental impact, at least until electric-powered aircraft become a viable long-haul option. But the biggest shift has been in the social conventions surrounding work. Having worked from home on such a large scale, many people found that not only could they do it, but also they actually enjoyed it, though many others didn't. In response, some of us began dreaming of a more flexible approach to work that had not previously occurred to us.
Gavin discovers he likes working from home, as long as the kids are at school. When the boss announced that we would be closing the office and all working from home, my first reaction was quite positive. I thought, okay, I can probably do this, since most of my work is online or over the phone, and the boss had told us we'd be having regular check-ins via Zoom. And it started out quite well. I set up a little office at home and got into quite a good routine. At that stage, Sal, my partner, was still going to her office, and the kids were on school holidays, so it was all reasonably manageable, though TV and video games probably got more of a bashing than was wise. Sal's mother came over occasionally to help out, or I sometimes dropped the kids off at her place. Then it all changed. Sal was told she had to work from home as well, and we learned the schools would not be opening at the end of the holidays. It also became clear that we couldn't expect Sal's mum to help out, because she had to be socially isolated too. To be frank, those next weeks were a nightmare. There we were, trying to supervise the kids' schoolwork while doing our own jobs and running the household as best we could. Chaos? That doesn't begin to describe it. At one point, Sal said to me, "I always knew there was a good reason why I didn't become a school teacher." We certainly developed a very different attitude to teachers. They suddenly looked like heroes to us. They are heroes. If they want more pay, give it to them. We developed a sort of system, but it was pretty flexible. The theory was that for 1 week, I would supervise the kids in the morning and Sal would take the afternoon shift. Then we'd switch the next week. It wasn't great, to be honest. I heard some parents on TV saying how it had brought them closer to their kids, and the kids were doing better at their schoolwork because of all the one-to-one attention they were getting. All I can say is, it wasn't like that at our place. Anyway, the schools finally reopened, and for the first time, Sal and I were at home by ourselves with separate working areas, and it all started to gel. I'm sure I was more productive than I normally was. Everything was a bit more efficient and focused, and when we had phone calls or Zoom meetings with people from work, we tended to stick to the point more than we might have in a normal meeting. Of course, I miss those corridor chats that break up the day at work, and I missed having coffee breaks or a drink after work with some of the people I work with. Funny thing, I was starting to miss some of the people who annoyed me at work. But the biggest thing was the lack of commuting. Normally, I drive through peak hour traffic for about half an hour, park the car, and then spend another half hour on the train into the city. That's 2 hours a day of travelling time I suddenly gained. It was incredible. Life became much less stressful. I just felt more relaxed about everything. When there was a tight deadline at work, I knew I'd be able to meet it. Anyway, when the lockdown was over and we were theoretically able to return to the normal routine, I spoke to the boss about a more flexible arrangement. I had proved I was capable of doing the work from home, so that wasn't an issue. We quickly came to an agreement that I would work from home on 2 days, unless I was needed for something, of course, and came in at lunchtime on the other 3 days, which meant I was entirely free of the morning peak hassle, and I could use my lunch break as travel time. So I think I'm actually putting in more hours in total. So far, so good. A few other people are doing the same sort of thing, And it works well enough because ours is a small office, so it's easy for the boss to keep track of where everyone is. And we all have to be there for the weekly staff meeting. I can see it would be trickier in a bigger outfit, but a mate of mine says his office has switched to hot desking because people are coming and going more flexibly than we are. It's funny, I'm not as attached to the workplace as I was. I really like knowing that I have the alternative, the flexibility.
As a society, we had talked for years about the benefits of creating more flexible working arrangements for office workers, in particular, by encouraging people to work from home for at least part of the week. But nothing much had come of it until the pandemic nudged us in the direction of new patterns of behaviour. Office workers is an important qualification. Clearly, there are many people whose occupation requires them to go to work. You can't build a house via Zoom, or run a production line, or teach a class of children, or care for the sick or elderly. As office workers entertain the idea of more flexible working arrangements, we need to be careful not to create yet another class division between the flexibles and the inflexibles when it comes to work practices. As is so often the case, the question is about privilege and how we compensate those who suffer from the lack of it. The shift to more flexible working arrangements has by no means revolutionised the workplace or the peak hour, but the gradual changes taking place as a result of the pandemic point to the possibility of further changes to come. If the social convention pre-pandemic was that office workers, with very few exceptions, felt they had to travel to and from their workplace at the same time, then that's a convention that is clearly under challenge, as is the convention that you have to go to work to get the work done, or always gather in the same place in order to have a productive meeting. One of the implications of changing work practices is that many workplaces will be reconfigured to accommodate more flexible working patterns and to make the workspace healthier and more resistant to the sharing of infections. For a start, hand sanitizers will be mandatory office equipment, and workstations will be rearranged to place more distance between workers. We may yet see the gradual return of individual offices, replacing the still fashionable but highly infection-prone open plan. The design and layout of many homes will change too, with more emphasis on the provision of serious home office space, either in the form of a dedicated room or a piece of furniture rather like an expanded version of the old writing bureau, where an office in a cupboard can be opened when it's in use and closed the rest of the time. And while we're in the home, we might also expect to see more flexible forms of housing, such as demountable granny flats and movable internal walls, become more popular to reflect a gradual return to the idea of three-generational households that can accommodate children living at home for longer than in previous generations, and a greater willingness to care for frail elderly parents within the family, rather than their wholesale consignment to institutions. With greater flexibility comes a reduced sense of busyness, the prospect of less stress, less rush, less urgency about acquiring more stuff, less need to go everywhere and do everything in such a hurry. I heard a medical practitioner say at the height of the pandemic that he was contemplating writing a book called How Coronavirus Saved My Life. The implication being that thanks to the big increase in telehealth appointments and a general reduction in workload, he was able to get back to the gym more regularly, read all the books in the pile by his bed, practice his clarinet, and generally lead a more ordered, less stressful life, though his drop in income would obviously have become a problem if the situation had gone on for too long. The changing social conventions in relation to work may help to reduce quite dramatically the stress associated with commuter travel for those who are fortunate enough to have the kind of work and the kind of employer that makes greater flexibility possible. A reduced demand on public transport and a reduction in peak hour traffic could act like pass-on benefits for those who are still obliged to commute daily. Adapting to Zoom culture. Social conventions evolve and adapt to suit changes in our way of life. When the motor car started to appear on our roads in large numbers, we had to agree on a few conventions we would follow, like keeping to the left or right of the road, giving way to cars on the left or right, and so on. Eventually, motor traffic became so heavy that we needed to express these conventions in actual laws that would govern our behaviour on the road. Even then, we couldn't agree on internationally accepted road rules, and different cultures show different levels of respect for the rules. I once watched a traffic cop in Paris simply abandon her post because her signals were being ignored by the drivers who had created the chaos that was engulfing her. She walked away nonchalantly, resigned, I thought, rather than angry. Not all cultures pay the same respect to traffic lights. Not all drivers interpret stop signs in the same way. In Canberra, where I live, stop signs are widely interpreted as a suggestion that it might not be an altogether bad idea to consider slowing down at this point. The person generally credited with inventing the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, suggested we might say "ahoy" when we answered a call. As a social convention, that didn't catch on, though a couple of members of my family have adopted it. Now we exchange so many messages via text that many people have simply dropped any form of salutation and signature, either assuming their name will appear or relying on the receiver to guess their identity from the content or their phone number. Many of our social conventions are connected with the technology we use, especially media technology. For years, it has been regarded as rude to read over someone's shoulder, since reading is such a private activity. That convention still applies in the case of smartphone and tablet screens. It's not okay to lean over and read someone else's screen when you're sitting next to them on a bus or train. On the other hand, when so many people conduct audible conversations in public places on their smartphone, it can hardly be considered rude to listen, since the right to privacy has been forfeited by the speaker. Though it's probably pushing your luck to chime in, "Oh yes, I was in Bali last year too. Tell your friend to be sure to visit the Lakalita bar." Letting your mobile phone ring in meetings, theatres, lectures, public meetings and places of worship is a no-no. I once attended a school speech day where in the midst of the principal's address, a phone rang in one of the front rows. The principal paused, leaned over the lectern, and addressed the offender directly. "I hope you're not proposing to answer that, madam," he said. A lot of surreptitious rummaging ensued as people all over the hall checked that their phones were on silent. Increasingly, of course, the social conventions surrounding mobile phone use are explicitly reinforced by announcements at public events just before the welcome to country. The need for such announcements emphasises the fact that strong social conventions regarding the use of mobile phones are still to be established. For instance, is it okay to check messages on your phone during a meal? Yes, in some households or social groups. No, in others. In many cinemas, announcements appear on the screen before the main feature, urging people not only to switch their phones to silent mode, but also not to talk during the film. Now, there's an example of a social convention in flux. In a bygone era, we would never have dreamed of talking during a movie. At worst, we'd have whispered softly to our companion. But we now view media content on so many platforms and mostly watch movies at home while talking freely to anyone who's present, or talking on our phone while half watching something, that we need to be reminded of our social obligations when we're in a public place. In the case of mobile phone use while driving, the absence of sufficiently strong social conventions has led to the passing of laws prohibiting the use of handheld phones for talking or texting while driving. As usual, when moral sensitivity or social norms are not powerful enough to control dangerous or antisocial behaviour, we need to create legal sanctions. As new technologies emerge, new social conventions evolve. During the pandemic lockdown, for example, Zoom entered our lives, trailing a stream of new questions about how we should behave. We might have used Skype and FaceTime, but nothing on the scale of the Zoom revolution. At the beginning of the lockdown, a prescient friend said he was selling all his shares and investing heavily in Zoom. As the security shortcomings of Zoom became apparent, other applications like Microsoft Teams were widely adopted by public service and commercial organisations, though Zoom remained the preferred platform for webinars. Webinar. Now there's a word that should have been strangled at birth. Symposia and community forums, and Zooming became an almost generic term for online gatherings. For years we had dreamed of video calls replacing conventional audio phone calls, and now that reality was with us. Meetings, conversations between couples or groups of friends, family birthday parties, grandchildren charming their grandparents, book clubs, church services, interviews, lectures, tutorials, webinars. Suddenly, the video call revolution was upon us, and we hadn't had time to figure out the conventions, let alone the technology. When someone leaves a Zoom meeting to take a phone call, for example, how do you persuade them to move further away so their conversation is not audible, or at least to mute their Zoom audio? Is it okay to point out that when someone stood up and walked away to make a cup of coffee, it became obvious that they were still wearing their pyjama pants beneath that Zoom viewable top? Is it acceptable to mention to someone you don't know very well that they have the screen of their computer angled so you're getting a terrific view of their under chin, nostrils, and the ceiling of their room? Should you mention that you've spotted a book on the shelves behind one of your Zoom partners that you'd quite like to borrow? Or to comment lightheartedly on an unmade bed or unwashed dishes visible in the background? As people previously unused to the technology were drawn into the online world of audiovisual encounters, unmute yourself became the cri du jour. We'll work all this out as we go along, as we will learn to agree in advance on the length of a Zoom encounter. An hour spent focused intently on a flat screen is far more demanding and therefore more tiring than an hour spent in a three-dimensional person-to-person encounter or even on the phone. Too many Zoom meetings in one day can turn you into a Zombie, to borrow a term coined by a friend of mine. When we meet and talk, there are multiple cues to guide the conversation. There's a kind of energy in the encounter that we respond to, and there can be comfortable pauses, which seem uncomfortable on Zoom, distractions, asides, subtle facial expressions, and other signals too faint to pick up on Zoom. And crucially, audio-visual encounters lack the magic of eye contact that acts like a superhighway to the brain. Zoom also adds a particular dimension to meetings that many of us find deeply uncomfortable, namely a view of ourselves. There you are, looking older than you feel, or acutely aware of the length or colour of your hair, or the inappropriateness of that shirt for this meeting. In the same way as we have to learn the social conventions of a new school, or a new job, or a new set of neighbours, so we have to learn, or help to create, the social conventions of a new medium. It's Zoom and its cousins now. There will be many more iterations to come. As long as we remember that conventions are boundaries we agree to set, that their purpose is to facilitate social harmony, and that the key to enduring social conventions is that they are based on a mutual acceptance of responsibility for each other's well-being, we won't go far wrong. If we are unable to devise functional social conventions based on our natural dispositions to kindness and fairness, the next step is rules and regulations. In a pandemic, the kindest thing we can do is to stay at home. If we can't be relied on to do that voluntarily, regulations will be needed to compel us to do so. The swiftly evolving convention of marriage. While we're talking about conventions that reflect the changing nature of our society, let's consider marriage. Groucho Marx once quipped, "Marriage is a wonderful institution. But then again, who wants to live in an institution?" The answer seems to be fewer and fewer of us. We might once have regarded stable marriages as one of the cornerstones of stable societies, and many people still hanker after that ideal. But when somewhere between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages will end in divorce, and the rate of relationship breakdown is higher for non-married couples, we need to acknowledge that there has been a huge shift in our social attitudes, reflected in a corresponding shift in the conventions surrounding cohabitation, parenthood, commitment, and loyalty. In essence, the emphasis has shifted from the idea of marriage as an institution, with its connotations of permanence, to the idea of marriage or other versions of sexual partnership as a relationship, with its connotations of flexibility and potential impermanence. We'll stick together as long as the relationship is working. That shift is expressed not only in the number of couples who split, but also in the number who decide never to marry at all in the formal legal sense. It is also reflected in the almost complete removal of the stigma that once attached to unmarried mothers, or single parents of either sex, to illegitimate children, to two parents of the same sex, and to the idea of a couple having a live-in sexual relationship before marriage. In the Dark Ages, when I was young, that was routinely referred to as living in sin. A weekend away for an unmarried couple was a dirty weekend. Who could possibly be nostalgic for the 1950s? The legal scaffolding around marriage as an institution has to be constantly modified to accommodate all these shifts, partly to acknowledge that as a society we still place a high cultural value on stable couple relationships, whether or not they happen to be formal marriages. Reproduction technology is also a rich source of evolving social conventions and, in turn, evolving legal responses. It can no longer be taken for granted that a child will have two readily identifiable parents, one female, one male, who have conceived that child with their own egg and sperm, either by natural or assisted means, and accepted joint responsibility for rearing the child. In the era of rapidly changing reproductive technology, a father might be regarded as either the anonymous person who donated his sperm or the person who is the partner of the mother and is committed to co-parenting the child with her. When the mother has donated her eggs to create, with the sperm of a donor, a fetus in vitro that will then be implanted in the uterus of another woman, legal complexities can obviously arise, compounded if the father's sperm were used to fertilize the egg of another unknown woman, and the resulting fetus were implanted in the uterus of a third woman, known as the surrogate mother, who had agreed to give the baby to the original couple as soon as it was born. The possible permutations are becoming increasingly complex, but the implication for social conventions is simple. We can no longer make straightforward assumptions about the genetic provenance of children born into our society, and as couples continue to postpone the conception of their first child, the resort to alternative means of reproduction will become more common. I recently met a woman who regularly takes her two children to a Dibblings, donor siblings, party, a gathering of all the children born to various mothers via sperm from the same donor. This type of event may yet become conventional. Manners are a signpost to morality. Before we leave the subject of social conventions and institutions, let's return to Jocelyn and the beau who held his knife like a pencil. Yes, it's only a knife, and quite possibly Jocelyn could gently point out to that man that she would prefer him to hold his knife the way she holds hers. But she might then be astonished to find that he regards the way she holds her knife as pretentious, awkward, and silly. Why doesn't she try holding it like a pencil the way he was taught to do? Each of them is saying, without quite saying it, that they are offended by the manners of the other. And that matters to them because manners, being one of the most obvious of social conventions, carry far more freight than they might appear to at first glance. They may be vaguely interpreted as a sign of the quality of a person's upbringing or breeding, their level of education, their degree of sophistication, their self-confidence, or conversely, their pretentiousness, their aloofness, or their closed-mindedness. Table manners, in particular, are quickly decoded by others. Does this person know which fork to use first? Is this person accustomed to eating pizza with cutlery or with bare hands? Does this person put more than one potato chip into her mouth at once? Does this person put his knife and fork neatly together when he's finished eating? And does he place the fork with its tines pointing down or up? Or does he deliberately leave his cutlery splayed rakishly across the plate as a symbol of his refusal to conform? A closet anarchist friend of mine does precisely that, though he's become more conformist as he ages, and I suspect his used cutlery will soon end up parallel on the plate. Among serious classical music concert goers, it's regarded as breathtakingly bad form to applaud after any of the early movements of a symphony, for example. You must hold your applause until the final movement has been played. For the uninitiated, this can be tricky, especially if you're dealing with a composer who ends an early movement with such an intense build-up to a final flourish that it would seem almost churlish not to clap. Years ago, a friend of mine was unceremoniously ditched by a girlfriend who took him to an orchestral concert and was deeply appalled when he was swept up in one of those first movement moments and joined the significant number of people in the audience who couldn't restrain themselves from clapping. Until that point, my friend had been holding his girlfriend's hand. Once he had realised his error, he reached for her hand again. By then, she had firmly crossed her arms, and that turned out to be a heavily symbolic gesture. My friend's gaffe proved terminal to the relationship. He had been merely embarrassed. She was mortified at finding herself in the company of someone who didn't know the rules of acceptable behaviour at performances of classical music. Madness, you might think, to attach such weight to such apparently trivial things, yet you probably do it quite unconsciously yourself. That's how it is with social conventions. Within any social group, the subtle messages conveyed by manners, dress, and speech act as badges of membership. Once institutionalised, they become part of the scaffolding that surrounds and stabilises the group. The whole business of social etiquette provides us with clues about our affinity and compatibility, and they hint at deeper cultural implications as well. In fact, manners and social customs, including language, are inextricably linked or indexed to the broader concept of morality. We often use such simple signs as information about a person's likely code of ethics, and that's not as crazy as it sounds. Good manners, after all, are a sign of our respect for other people, a sign of politeness, a sign of our desire not to offend. And when that is all multiplied, it leads to the larger moral question of whether this person is generally respectful and sensitive to others, since respect and sensitivity to others' needs and well-being are the very essence of morality. What else could morality be about, given that it's an entirely relational concept? When someone puts their feet on a seat in a train and loudly punctuates their conversation with fuck, they are sending a clear and possibly deliberate message to others in the carriage who regard seats on public transport as public property to be respected and who are offended by the gratuitous use of bad language. In return, they are likely to perceive the offenders as lacking sensitivity and a sense of social responsibility. When someone burps loudly in a social setting where loud burping is offensive, or drinks too much and becomes loud and incoherent in a group that values restraint, that behaviour will be interpreted by the members of such a group as disrespectful and insensitive. It's starting to sound as if I might be the kind of person who's super sensitive to feet on railway seats, public burping, drunkenness, and so on. If I am, that would be a function of the kind of upbringing I had and of the way I tried to raise my own children. However, because I know this about myself, I try not to read too much into antisocial behaviour because I recognise that it's not always deliberately antisocial. Yet that very term gives the game away. Whether it's a lack of good manners, or a more egregious example like lying or cheating, or flouting the rules about self-isolation during a pandemic, Any antisocial behaviour is a sign of selfish disregard for the well-being of others. What about free speech? We're all in favour of it, aren't we? Except that we know there must be limits here too. In a liberal democracy, we are more firmly against racism, sexism, ageism and hate speech than we are for free speech. We don't tolerate insults based on a person's gender or ethnicity, or their religious or political beliefs, or their cultural practices, unless they violate our laws. As usual, it's all a matter of striking the right balance. In this case, the balance between the freedom to speak my mind and the need to show respect and kindness towards other persons. Whoever they may be, they are part of who I am, via our common humanity. We might not like being surrounded, pressured, feeling hemmed in by social conventions ranging from good manners to moral precepts like do unto others. But like the grander institutions we create, their main purpose is to lubricate the machinery of social cohesion and to help promote social harmony, to encourage and reinforce kindness as the core of our culture. Without social conventions, we descend into chaos. And when we show that we can't be trusted to observe conventions that strengthen the fabric of a society and protect the safety and security of its citizens, we very properly resort to legislation. The big message? The kinder, fairer, more socially sensitive and responsible we are, the less regulation and legislation we will need. What should we do with the information that because we belong to a social species, we need to protect each other by having a strong framework of conventions and institutions? Treat the idea of a social species as a checkpoint, a restraint. Every time we're about to assert our independence, we need to remind ourselves that we are interdependent as well. If my expressions of individualism or identity become too strident, they might also become antisocial. To repeat the question raised at the end of Chapter 2, are my desires socially desirable? Insist that institutions place the common good above their own interests. Institutions are supposed to respect and uphold the noblest and most aspirational values of the society they exist to serve. If we work for an institution, whether governmental, legal, academic, professional, commercial, religious, or cultural, we need to be mindful of the fact that no institution is a law unto itself. No institution can legitimately survive by serving only its own internal purposes. Respect other people's social conventions as much as we respect our own. Theirs are the product of their upbringing, as ours are the product of ours. We might question them, debate them, and perhaps even encourage people to modify them. But this should all be done from a position of kindness based on respect for otherness. That's not the end of the story, though. We should challenge conventions when they have outlived their usefulness or are failing to do their job of promoting kindness and social cohesion. We did that when we voted in favour of same-sex marriage. And we should be free to challenge and criticise institutions that are guilty of putting their interests ahead of ours. We do that whenever we appoint a royal commission, like the recent inquiries into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, into misconduct in the banking industry, and into the quality of aged care. So here's the beautiful symmetry of social conventions. We need them to constrain us, and they need us to constrain them.
This ends CD 6.